My name is Victoria Sterling. I am 34 years old and I am a chief executive officer masquerading as a freelance accountant. They thought I was a clueless broke girl, desperate to marry into their prestigious family, so they did not bother hiding their true colors. But the moment I revealed who I actually was and dismantled their entire financial existence in front of their elite friends, their world shattered. They fell to their knees begging me to stay. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who severely underestimated your worth. The crystal chandeliers of the Prescott Country Club in Seattle cast a cold, glittering light over 200 of the city's most influential socialites. Wearing an off-the-rack polyester blend dress that intentionally clashed with the sea of custom couture, I stood near a massive swan eyes sculpture. Julian Prescott and my 35-year-old fiancé stood beside me holding a glass of vintage champagne. His mother Beatrice approached us wearing an emerald green silk gown that probably cost more than the annual rent of the apartment Julian thought I lived in. Beatrice clinked her spoon against her crystal flute, commanding the attention of the ballroom. She smiled a razor-sharp grin that did not reach her eyes. To Julian and Victoria, she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. We Prescotts have always believed in giving back to the community and taking in those less fortunate. Victoria, we welcome you to our lineage. It is truly a modern fairy tale, seeing a struggling charity case elevated to this level of society. The room erupted in polite, uncomfortable laughter. I turned to Julian, expecting at least a whisper of defense. Instead, he chuckled, taking a sip of his champagne and wrapping an arm around my waist. He leaned in and whispered, "Just let her have this, Victoria. You know how much this country club means to her." I did not flush, I did not cry. I maintained a steady, unblinking gaze as the Seattle elite toasted to my supposed poverty. What Julian and Beatrice did not know, what none of these people sipping their expensive wine knew, was that the Prescott family wealth was a meticulously maintained illusion. Their ancestral estates were mortgaged to the hilt, and Julian's self-made tech venture capital firm only existed because I had been secretly funding it for the past 5 years. I used blind proxies and offshore holding companies to inject millions into his failing startups because I wanted to see what kind of man he would become when he tasted success. The answer was standing right next to me, laughing at my public humiliation to protect his mother's fragile ego. I watched Beatrice glide through the crowd, accepting praises from her friends. She moved with the arrogant certainty of a woman who believed her bloodline shielded her from the consequences of bankruptcy. Earlier that evening, she had cornered me in the bridal suite, handing me a printed list of acceptable behaviors for a Prescott wife. She explicitly instructed me not to speak about my freelance accounting work to any of the venture capitalists in attendance, claiming my small-minded numbers would bore them. I simply nodded and smiled, tucking the embossed list into my cheap synthetic clutch. It was fascinating to observe their delusions in real time. For half a decade, I had operated Sterling Capital Management from a skyscraper downtown, controlling assets that could buy this entire country club 10 times over. I chose to hide my identity because wealth attracts parasites, and I needed to know if Julian loved me or my portfolio. During our first year together, he passed every test. He brought me coffee when I pretended to pull all-nighters doing tax returns for small businesses. He supported my fictional struggles, but the moment my blind proxies wired the first $10 million in Series A funding to his firm, the entitlement set in. He traded his humble ambition for bespoke suits and luxury cars bought with my untraceable money. He began introducing me to his new colleagues with a tone of apologetic condescension. "My sweet little number cruncher," he would say, patting my hand. Tonight was the rehearsal dinner for a wedding I was fully prepared to walk away from. But simply leaving would not be enough. The Prescotts had insulted my intelligence and tried to subjugate my existence. In the corporate world, when an entity attempts a hostile takeover of your dignity, you do not just walk away, you orchestrate a comprehensive liquidation of their assets. I took a sip of my sparkling water, observing the venture capitalists Julian was currently trying to impress. They were men I regularly dismantled in boardrooms. Men who would pale if they knew the architect of their recent market losses was standing by the ice sculpture in a discount dress. Julian was aggressively pitching them a new algorithm, boasting about his innate financial genius. I listened to his pitch with a quiet, detached amusement. The code he was bragging about was structurally flawed. I knew this because I had written the original base code years ago, and he had stolen a fragmented version of it from my personal laptop, assuming I would not notice or understand the complex programming. He actually believed his struggling accountant fiancé was too simple-minded to comprehend algorithmic trading. Beatrice drifted back to my side, interrupting my thoughts. She placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, her diamond rings digging into my collarbone. "Try to mingle, Victoria," she ordered, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But please, do not embarrass us by discussing your little bookkeeping business. These men deal in millions, not pocket change." I offered her a serene smile, the kind of smile I usually reserved for rival CEOs, right before I finalized a corporate buyout. "Of course, Beatrice," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I would not dream of discussing pocket change tonight." She scoffed and walked away, completely unaware that she had just sealed her family's absolute financial ruin. Julian finally returned to my side, his face flushed with the thrill of his own perceived brilliance. "Did you see that?" he asked, gesturing to the group of wealthy investors. "I have them eating out of the palm of my hand. After the wedding, we are going to be unstoppable. I just need you to sign a few standard documents tomorrow morning to protect the firm. Investors get nervous, you know." I looked at him, taking in the arrogance, the deceit, the utter lack of respect for the woman he claimed to love. He was setting up the prenuptial ambush just as my legal team had predicted. I knew exactly what was inside those documents, and I knew exactly how I was going to use his own aggressive legal traps against him. "That sounds very responsible, Julian," I said, keeping my tone completely neutral. "You should always protect your assets." He grinned, kissing my cheek, oblivious to the fact that his entire empire was built on a foundation of sand, and I was holding the ocean. The evening continued its parade of shallow wealth and hollow promises. I stood there, absorbing every insult, every condescending pat on the back, every thinly veiled joke at my expense. I catalogued them all with the cold precision of a lead prosecutor building an airtight case. They wanted a naive poor girl to mold into a compliant accessory. They thought they had trapped a mouse. They did not realize they had invited a predator into their glass house, and I was about to throw the first stone. The applause from Beatrice's humiliating toast had barely faded into the vaulted ceiling when Julian gripped my elbow. His fingers pressed into my skin with a possessive urgency. He guided me away from the melting swan ice sculpture and toward the head table. The table was draped in heavy white linen and adorned with cascading white orchids. Julian pulled out my chair with an exaggerated flourish, playing the devoted gentleman for the venture capitalists, observing us. I smoothed the cheap synthetic fabric of my dress and sat down. Julian did not sit next to me. He remained standing, looming over my chair. He reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke Italian tuxedo and withdrew a thick vellum envelope. He placed it onto the pristine white tablecloth next to my crystal goblet. The heavy cream paper looked entirely out of place among the fine china and polished silver. Beatrice stood just a few feet away, keeping her sharp eyes fixed on our interaction. She was waiting for me to break. I looked up at Julian, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Julian leaned down until his face was inches from my ear. He smelled of expensive cologne and the arrogance of a man who believed he had conquered the financial world. "Victoria," he whispered, his tone dripping with condescending sweetness. "We need to handle a little piece of administrative business before the evening goes any further." I glanced at the envelope and then back to his eyes. "What is this, Julian?" I asked, my voice calm and devoid of the panic he hoped to provoke. He sighed heavily, the sigh of a man burdened by his own success. "It is a prenuptial agreement," he said softly, though loud enough for his mother to hear. "My lead investors called an emergency board meeting this afternoon. They are thrilled about the algorithm, but they are incredibly nervous about my personal liability. They know you are just a freelance accountant, Victoria. They know about your financial instability. They insisted I protect my assets and the future of the firm." He tapped the thick envelope. "I need you to sign this tonight to reassure them that my capital is secure." I stared at the envelope. Julian was lying. My own proxy firms were his lead investors, and I certainly had not called an emergency board meeting. He wanted to ensure that the struggling girl he was marrying could never touch the empire he believed he had built single-handedly. "Open it, Victoria," he urged, impatience bleeding into his voice. "It is a standard 90-10 split in my favor. It is more than generous considering the massive wealth disparity between us. If we divorce, you walk away with a small stipend, and I retain absolute control over the firm, the intellectual property, and all real estate holdings." I did not move to touch the document. Julian leaned closer, his jaw tightening. "Look, Victoria, you have to sign this right now. My lawyers drafted it this afternoon, and they are waiting for the confirmation. If you truly love me, if you are not just some gold digger trying to secure a meal ticket, you will sign it quite quietly. Prove to me and my family that you are here for the right reasons. Prove that you are not just after the Prescott money." The absolute irony of his demand almost made me smile. He was sitting on a throne built entirely of my money, demanding I prove I was not a gold digger. I slowly reached out and broke the wax seal on the envelope. I withdrew the crisp legal documents. They were 50 pages of dense boilerplate text, aggressively formatted by a downtown corporate law firm known for bullying vulnerable spouses. I did not ask for a pen. I simply began to read. Julian shifted his weight, clearly agitated that I was actually reviewing the contract instead of blindly weeping and signing it to prove my devotion. "You do not need to read the whole thing, Victoria," he hissed. "It is full of complex legal jargon you will not understand. Just flip to the last page and sign on the dotted line." I ignored him. I could see Beatrice smirking from the corner of my eye, sipping her wine and anticipating my emotional collapse. But I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. My eyes scanned the pages with the rapid precision of a woman who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers before her 30th birthday. I absorbed the clauses, the stipulations, the aggressive asset protection frameworks designed to leave me destitute. Buried deep within the indemnification section on page 30, I found it. His aggressive lawyers relied too heavily on standard template language. They had drafted a mutual indemnification and liability clause intended to protect Julian from any hidden debts I might bring into the marriage. The clause stated any debt, fraudulent financial activity, or corporate liability incurred by either party during the marriage would be wholly and personally assumed by the offending party, bypassing limited liability company protections. They had made the liability clauses entirely reciprocal. My elite legal mind locked onto the fatal flaw. Julian thought he was protecting his assets from my poverty. He did not realize he was legally binding his personal social security number to his own corporate actions. Because Julian was currently embezzling money from our joint accounts to fund his secret life, this exact clause would strip away his corporate veil. If I signed this document, he would be entirely personally liable for the federal wire fraud he was unwittingly committing against my holding companies. I looked at the specific paragraph again, confirming the absolute legal finality of the language. It was a flawless, catastrophic trap of his own making. I looked up at Julian, who was checking his watch with profound irritation. He thought he was outsmarting a naive girl. He had no idea he had just handed a loaded weapon to a strategic mastermind. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open momentarily, drowning out the string quartet. Heads turned as Savannah made her entrance. She was Julian's newly appointed junior partner, though everyone in his inner circle understood her actual title. She wore a crimson silk slip dress that adhered to every curve, paired with strappy designer heels that clicked loudly against the parquet floor. She moved with the performative, breathless energy of someone who wanted everyone to know exactly how busy and important she was. Beatrice immediately stood up from her chair, her face breaking into a wide, genuine smile that she had entirely withheld from me all evening. Beatrice waved Savannah over to our table, completely ignoring the fact that the seating chart had placed Julian's lead investors in those prime spots. With a flick of her wrist, Beatrice directed a waiter to clear a space directly to Julian's, right effectively boxing me out on his left. Savannah slid into the chair, her perfume a heavy cloud of jasmine and vanilla that immediately overpowered the delicate scent of the white orchids on the table. Julian sat up straighter, his chest puffing out slightly as he turned his full attention to her. He did not introduce us. He did not even acknowledge my presence. Instead, he poured her a glass of the vintage champagne, leaning in so close their shoulders brushed. I sat quietly, resting my hands in my lap, observing the scene with the detached fascination of a scientist watching bacteria multiply in a petri dish. As Savannah reached for the crystal flute, the ballroom lights caught a flash of brilliance on her wrist. It was a flawless diamond tennis bracelet set in platinum with a very specific vintage clasp. I recognized it instantly. 3 weeks ago, Julian had told me he needed to make an emergency withdrawal from our shared checking account to cover unexpected vendor retainers for his tech startup. He claimed the firm was facing a temporary cash flow issue and he needed my meager freelance savings to bridge the gap. I had agreed playing the supportive struggling partner and watched him transfer $25,000 out of the account. I had already traced the funds through my own forensic accountants. I knew he had not paid any vendors. He had walked straight into a high-end jeweler in downtown Seattle and purchased that exact bracelet. He assumed I was too foolish to ask for invoices or question his business expenses. He believed my accounting skills were limited to balancing basic ledgers for local bakeries. Seeing the stolen diamonds draped across his mistress's wrist did not incite a jealous rage. It simply provided visual confirmation of his financial fraud. It was physical evidence of his embezzlement sitting right across the table from me, glittering under the chandeliers. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, locking the image into my memory for the impending legal slaughter. Savannah leaned closer to Julian, her crimson lips brushing against his cheek in a greeting that lingered several seconds too long for a professional relationship. She left a faint smudge of red lipstick near his jawline. "I am so sorry I am late," she purred, her voice carrying a deliberate breathy volume designed to ensure I could hear every word. The closing took absolutely forever, but the sellers finally accepted the addendums. Julian smirked, reaching up to casually brush his hand against hers, under the guise of steadying her champagne glass. "You handled it perfectly, Savannah," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. "You always know exactly how to close the deal." Beatrice watched the exchange with undisguised approval. She looked at me, her eyes darting to the cheap polyester of my dress, and then back to Savannah's designer silk, silently communicating her clear preference. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of my public humiliation. She wanted me to feel small, unwanted, and entirely out of my depth. She wanted me to realize that Savannah was the caliber of woman Julian truly deserved, a woman with ambition, style, and supposedly her own wealth. What Beatrice failed to understand was that true power does not need to announce itself with stolen diamonds or performative arrogance. True power sits quietly and lets its enemies dig their own graves. I offered Savannah a polite, vacuous smile when she finally deigned to look in my direction. Savannah turned her attention back to Julian, entirely dismissing me after a single pitying glance. "So about our new project," she said, using air quotes around the word project. "The escrow agent confirmed the wire transfer cleared this afternoon. We just need to finalize the capital gain structure and sign the irrevocable proxy forms by Tuesday. The penthouse is officially locked in." Julian beamed, a look of pure, greedy satisfaction washing over his face. "That is brilliant work," he replied. "Once we execute the deed of trust through the blind corporate shell, the property will be shielded from any marital asset division. It is the perfect long-term investment." They smiled at each other, sharing their private joke right in front of me. They were using high-level commercial real estate jargon, assuming the struggling freelance accountant would just hear boring business terminology. They thought I was completely oblivious to the fact that they were openly discussing purchasing a luxury penthouse together using a corporate shell company. They believed they were speaking in code. They did not know they were speaking my native language. I knew exactly what a deed of trust entailed. I understood the mechanics of a blind corporate shell better than the attorneys who had drafted their paperwork. And more importantly, I knew that the wire transfer Savannah just mentioned had originated from the exact same holding account Julian was currently using to embezzle my venture capital funds. They were not shielding an asset. They were documenting a federal crime. I maintained my perfectly blank expression, letting them revel in their assumed intellectual superiority. I simply adjusted my posture silently, calculating the exact prison sentence for wire fraud, and waited for the night to unfold. The ambient noise of the gilded ballroom hummed as Julian and Savannah continued to revel in their thinly veiled discussions of corporate shell companies and luxury penthouses. They were so intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance that they completely ignored the silence radiating from my side of the table. Beatrice sat across from us, gripping her crystal wineglass, her eyes locked onto my face. She was waiting for the inevitable breakdown. She wanted the struggling freelance accountant to burst into tears to justify my permanent exclusion from their prestigious lineage. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I remained perfectly still, letting the cold reality of their betrayal wash over me, not as a victim, but as a lead prosecutor finalizing the timeline of a criminal conspiracy. They had laid out their entire embezzlement scheme right in front of me, using stolen venture capital funds to finance their illicit lives, while aggressively pushing a predatory prenuptial agreement. It was a masterpiece of arrogant stupidity. Julian finally turned his attention away from Savannah's crimson lips and looked down at the thick vellum envelope resting next to my water goblet. He tapped the heavy paper with his index finger, his expression immediately hardening into a mask of corporate impatience. "We are running out of time, Victoria," he said, his voice clipped and demanding. "The board needs confirmation that my personal assets are shielded from your financial instability before the market opens on Monday. Sign the document so we can move forward with the evening." I did not plead for fairness or ask for a delay to have my own fictional bargain lawyers review the dense paperwork. I simply nodded. I reached down and picked up the cheap synthetic clutch resting on my lap. The clasp made a dull plastic click as I opened it. Beatrice watched my hands closely, perhaps expecting me to pull out a tissue to wipe away non-existent tears. Instead, I retrieved my personal writing instrument. It was a solid gold Cartier fountain pen. It was a bespoke vintage piece I had purchased for myself after closing my first billion-dollar acquisition 5 years ago. It carried the weight of my actual legacy. I held the Cartier pen in my right hand, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of the solid gold barrel against my skin. It was a fleeting flash of my true status hiding in plain sight. Julian and Beatrice were so blinded by their own entitlement and so convinced of my absolute poverty that they did not even register the exquisite craftsmanship of the object in my hand. To them, it was just another pen. To me, it was the instrument of their financial execution. I pulled the 50-page contract from the envelope and flipped directly to the final signature page, bypassing the aggressive indemnification clauses and the deeply flawed reciprocal liability language I had already memorized. I uncapped the pen. The polished gold nib caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. I pressed the nib to the heavy cream vellum. My hand did not shake. My breathing remained perfectly even. I executed my signature with a flawless, steady rhythm, leaving a dark, bold trail of ink across the dotted line. I was legally binding Julian Prescott to his own federal wire fraud. By signing this specific document, I activated the mechanism that would strip away his corporate protections and expose his personal social security number to the devastating consequences of his embezzlement. I capped the pen with a sharp metallic click and slipped it back into my cheap clutch. I slid the signed document across the pristine white tablecloth until it rested directly in front of Julian. He looked down at my signature, and a slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He actually believed he had won. He believed he had successfully intimidated a naive broke girl into surrendering any future claim to his supposedly massive wealth. He slid the envelope into the breast pocket of his bespoke tuxedo, patting it flat against his chest. Beatrice let out a long, dramatic exhale of relief, leaning back in her chair and signaling a waiter to refill her champagne flute. The charity case had been successfully neutralized. I stood up from the formal dining table, moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace. I smoothed the skirt of my off-the-rack polyester dress. Julian looked up at me, his smirk faltering slightly at my complete lack of emotional distress. "Where exactly are you going?" he asked, his tone betraying a slight hint of confusion. I looked down at him, sitting there next to his mistress. I smiled at him. It was a deadly, calm smile, perfectly devoid of warmth or affection. "I am going home, Julian," I said, my voice projecting a clear, chilling authority that he had never heard from me before. "I want to congratulate you on your brilliant legal foresight tonight. You have protected your assets exactly as they deserve to be protected." Julian blinked, clearly unsettled by my sudden composure, but too arrogant to question it. He simply nodded, assuming I was retreating in defeat. I turned away from the head table and began walking toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look back. I navigated through the sea of wealthy venture capitalists and Seattle socialites, moving with the quiet pride of a woman who knew she owned the entire chessboard. Every step I took away from that table was a step towards my own vindication. Julian thought he was the architect of my humiliation. He had no idea he was merely a pawn in my systemic restructuring. His compliance in forcing that signature gave him a false sense of absolute victory. I pushed open the ballroom doors and stepped out into the cool, quiet hallway, leaving the noise of their artificial high society behind me. The intricate legal trap was flawlessly set into motion. All I had to do now was wait for him to finally step off the ledge. The crisp Seattle night air hit my face the moment I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the Prescott Country Club. I did not wait for the valet. I did not look back at the glowing windows of the ballroom where Julian and his mother were celebrating their perceived victory. I pulled the thin fabric of my off-the-rack dress tightly around my shoulders and began walking down the manicured driveway. I walked for exactly 2 blocks, letting the artificial laughter and the clinking of crystal fade into the distance. The transition from Victoria, the struggling accountant, to Victoria, the titan of corporate finance, required this brief physical journey. As I turned the corner onto a secluded oak-lined avenue, the sleek black silhouette of an extended wheelbase Maybach emerged from the shadows. My driver, Marcus, had been waiting exactly where I instructed. He stepped out immediately wearing a flawless dark suit and opened the heavy rear door for me with a respectful nod. He did not ask how the rehearsal dinner went. He already knew the objective of the evening. I stepped into the spacious cabin of the Maybach and sank into the cream leather seating. The door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, sealing me inside a soundproof vault of absolute luxury. The contrast between my cheap polyester dress and the multi-million-dollar vehicle was a stark reminder of the double life I had maintained for half a decade. I reached into a concealed compartment panel in the center console and retrieved my encrypted titanium tablet. My thumb pressed against the biometric scanner and the screen illuminated instantly, displaying the secure dashboard of Sterling Capital Management. I am the founder and sole managing director of the firm. I built my empire from the ground up, starting with a small inheritance and turning it into a global portfolio of commercial real estate and venture capital funds. By the time I was 29, I was controlling assets that rivaled the oldest families in the Pacific Northwest. But massive wealth creates an isolating gravitational pull. It attracts a specific breed of corporate parasites and social climbers who view a successful woman not as a partner, but as a host to be drained. 5 years ago, I decided I was finally done being a financial target. I created a carefully constructed alias. I rented a modest 1-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood. I bought a wardrobe of mass-market clothing and adopted the persona of a struggling freelance accountant who spent her days buried in tax forms for local bakeries. I wanted to meet someone who valued my intellect and my character without the intoxicating influence of my bank accounts. That was exactly when I met Julian Prescott. He was a low-level analyst at a struggling boutique firm with big dreams of dominating the tech industry. During our first year together, Julian was humble and fiercely dedicated. He passed every early test I devised. He brought me takeout coffee when I pretended to work late on clients' spreadsheets. He drove my reliable used sedan without complaint. He spoke passionately about building a legacy through hard work rather than inherited privilege. I truly believed I had found a partner who possessed genuine ambition. I believed he loved the woman beneath the balance sheets. My fatal miscalculation was assuming his character was permanent. 2 years into our relationship, I decided to test his business acumen. Using a network of blind proxies and offshore shell companies, I quietly funneled $10 million in Series A funding into his newly formed tech venture capital firm. I wanted to give him the resources to achieve his dreams so we could eventually build an empire together as equals. But Julian did not respond to success with gratitude or strategic humility. The moment the artificial capital hit his accounts, his entire personality shifted. The sudden influx of wealth acted as an accelerant for his latent arrogance and entitlement. He immediately upgraded his wardrobe to bespoke Italian suits and leased luxury vehicles he could not genuinely afford. He began treating service workers with disdain and started introducing me to his new elite circle with an air of profound embarrassment. He succumbed to greed the moment he tasted a success he had not actually earned. As I stared at the glowing financial readouts on my encrypted tablet, I traced the exact trajectory of his moral decay. The data did not lie. The ledgers showed how he had systematically redirected the venture capital funds I provided to finance his opulent new lifestyle and his affair with Savannah. He thought he was a self-made genius, outsmarting the market and outgrowing the naive woman who had supposedly held him back. He never realized he was simply a lab rat running through a maze I had designed and funded. His mother, Beatrice, had amplified his worst traits, convincing him that his newly acquired wealth made him vastly superior to my fabricated poverty. They believed my lack of pedigree made me disposable. They did not understand that I was not a participant in their high society games. I was the bank rolling the entire casino. I closed the financial application and opened a direct secure messaging channel to my lead corporate litigator. The trap I had set with the prenuptial agreement was now perfectly armed. Julian had eagerly signed away his corporate veil to protect himself from my non-existent debts, binding his personal social security number to the federal wire fraud he was committing against my holding companies. I typed a brief command instructing my legal team to prepare the final asset freezing protocols for Monday morning. I locked the tablet and placed it back into the concealed compartment. The Maybach glided smoothly through the dark city streets, carrying me back to the reality I had built. Julian had failed the ultimate test of character, but his complete failure would secure the absolute preservation of my financial legacy. The soundproof cabin of the Maybach isolated me from the blurring city lights of downtown Seattle. The ambient glow of the street lamps slipped over the tinted glass as I sat in the plush leather interior, contemplating the sheer magnitude of Julian's arrogance. My encrypted mobile device vibrated against the polished walnut console. The caller identification displayed a secure routing number. It was Dana Morrison, my lead forensic accountant, and one of the most ruthless financial analysts on the West Coast. I had deployed Dana 3 weeks ago when I first noticed a slight discrepancy in the burn rate of Julian's venture capital firm. I tapped the screen to answer, placing the call on the secure vehicle audio system. "Good evening, Dana," I said, my voice steady and perfectly modulated. "Tell me you have finished the audit." Her voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers, carrying the crisp, no-nonsense tone of a woman who spent her life dismantling corporate fraudsters. "I have, Victoria," she replied, "and you are not going to believe the level of sheer financial incompetence your fiancé has managed to achieve." He did not just cross the line into embezzlement. He sprinted past it and practically gift-wrapped a federal indictment. I leaned back into the cream leather seating, steepling my fingers. "Walk me through the mechanics, Dana," I instructed. When Julian and I first moved in together, he insisted we open a basic joint checking account at a mid-tier retail bank. He claimed it was a symbolic gesture of our partnership to handle shared household expenses like groceries and utility bills. I had agreed, playing the role of the devoted, frugal girlfriend while secretly maintaining my multi-billion-dollar portfolio elsewhere. Julian assumed this meager checking account represented the entirety of my financial liquidity. He thought I was diligently balancing our grocery budget down to the last cent. According to Dana's report, he had weaponized that exact assumption. Julian had been siphoning capital from the Series A funding rounds I had secretly provided to his tech firm. But rather than using sophisticated offshore accounts to hide the theft, he took the path of absolute hubris. He transferred massive sums of venture capital directly into our retail joint checking account. He then immediately wired those funds out to various external accounts, assuming I was too mathematically illiterate to notice the massive cash flow moving through the ledger. He thought he was moving too fast for a freelance accountant to catch the discrepancies. Dana detailed the exact nature of the outgoing wires. The funds were not being used to pay software developers or secure server space. They were financing a shadow life. Julian had diverted nearly $3 million over the past 14 months. He used the stolen capital to purchase the vintage Cartier tennis bracelet I had just seen glittering on Savannah's wrist. He had paid for first-class flights to Paris and Milan, categorized in his corporate ledger as business development trips, but completely aligned with Savannah's social media vacation posts. And most significantly, he had initiated the massive wire transfer to the escrow holding company for the luxury penthouse they had been discussing at the rehearsal dinner. He was funding a billionaire lifestyle on my dime, using our shared domestic account as his personal laundering machine. The audacity was insulting, but the execution was amateurish. I listened as Dana outlined the digital paper trail. Julian knew he could not simply wire $3 million directly from our joint account to Savannah without triggering suspicious activity reports at the retail bank. He needed an intermediary to wash the funds and make them appear as legitimate corporate disbursements. "Here is where your fiancé overplayed his hand," Dana explained, her tone dripping with analytical disdain. Julian contracted a discount online legal service to find a dormant shell company to act as a pass-through entity. He wanted a corporate name that sounded established and boring so he could invoice it for fictional consulting services. He found a dormant limited liability company registered in Delaware called Apex Holdings. He assumed because it had zero active public filings for the past 4 years, it was just a discarded corporate husk he could hijack for his laundering scheme. He submitted the fabricated invoices to his own venture firm, paid them out to our joint checking account, and then wired the washed money directly into the operating account of Apex Holdings. From there, he planned to distribute the clean funds to Savannah and the real estate escrow agents. I closed my eyes visualizing the corporate structure. The name Apex Holdings was instantly familiar to me. It was not a discarded husk. I had registered Apex Holdings 7 years ago during a complex commercial real estate acquisition in the tech corridor. I had simply parked the entity and left it dormant after the acquisition was finalized. Julian, in his desperate attempt to look like a financial mastermind, had blindly selected a corporate shell out of a digital registry without conducting proper due diligence. He did not hire a real attorney to vet the entity. He just wanted a quick fix to hide his stolen money. "Do you understand what he has done, Victoria?" Dana asked, a rare note of genuine excitement bleeding into her professional demeanor. "By routing the stolen venture capital through your joint account and then directly into a subsidiary of Sterling Capital Management, he has completely bypassed his own corporate protections. He has pierced his own corporate veil." I opened my eyes, staring at the digital readouts on my tablet. I understood the legal ramifications with absolute clarity. The corporate veil is a legal concept that protects business owners from personal liability for corporate debts or actions. But when a business owner mixes personal and corporate funds or uses a corporate entity to commit fraud, the courts will pierce that veil, holding the individual personally and financially responsible. By using our domestic checking account to move corporate funds, Julian had instantly destroyed the legal barrier between his tech firm and his personal assets. But the fatal blow was routing the money into Apex Holdings. He had unwittingly wired stolen funds directly into a corporate entity wholly owned and controlled by my primary holding company. He had effectively handed the stolen money right back to me, complete with a flawless digital audit trail, proving his intent to defraud his investors. Furthermore, crossing state lines to move illicit funds through digital banking channels constituted federal wire fraud. Each individual transfer carried a maximum penalty of 20 years in federal prison. Julian had initiated over 40 separate transfers. The sheer poetry of his failure was astonishing. He had treated me like an uneducated dependent, continuously mocking my fictional accounting career while building his entire illicit financial structure on a foundation of absolute incompetence. He believed his Ivy League education and arrogant posturing made him untouchable. Yet he had managed to construct a criminal conspiracy so fragile that a single forensic audit completely dismantled it in less than 3 weeks. Julian had not just betrayed our relationship, he had insulted my professional honor by executing such a sloppy, poorly disguised embezzlement scheme against my own injected capital. Dana. I want every single transaction verified and cross-referenced with the fabricated invoices he submitted to the venture firm. I commanded, my voice carrying the heavy weight of a seasoned chief executive preparing for total corporate warfare. I want the entire paper trail bound into a comprehensive digital dossier. Ensure that the chain of custody for the banking records is airtight without any gaps. We are not just preparing for a civil dissolution, we are assembling a definitive criminal referral for the Department of Justice to ensure his complete destruction. Consider it done, Victoria, Dana replied immediately. I already have my senior team working on the final affidavits and supporting exhibits. We will have the entire forensic package ready for your final review by tomorrow morning. Your fiancé has absolutely no idea what is coming for him or how completely exposed he actually is right now. He thinks he has already won, I said, staring out the window of the Maybach as we navigated through the quiet, upscale neighborhoods toward my actual residence. He thinks he outsmarted a naive girl and secured his stolen wealth through that predatory prenuptial agreement he practically forced me to sign. He has no concept of the legal avalanche he just triggered by attempting to steal from the very woman funding his entire existence. I terminated the call and placed the encrypted device back onto the polished walnut console. The silence inside the luxury vehicle was profound and deeply satisfying. I had spent 5 years suppressing my true nature, minimizing my intellect to make space for Julian's fragile ego. I had allowed him to take credit for the capital I provided and the strategic advice I disguised as casual domestic suggestions. I had tolerated his mother's endless condescension and his increasingly blatant disrespect. But the discovery of this embezzlement changed the fundamental nature of our entire conflict. It was no longer a matter of simple heartbreak or basic social humiliation. Julian had crossed the ultimate red line. He had attempted to steal my assets to finance a life with his mistress, while simultaneously trying to legally trap me in a state of manufactured poverty forever. I leaned my head against the soft leather headrest, feeling a deep, cold serenity settle over my mind. The emotional vulnerability I might have felt regarding the end of my engagement evaporated entirely, replaced by the clinical precision of a corporate executioner ready to strike. The social game was definitively over. The systemic financial warfare had officially begun. I would not just leave Julian at the altar to save my own pride. I would systematically strip away every stolen asset, every fabricated accomplishment, and every ounce of his unearned social capital. He wanted to play the role of the ruthless venture capitalist, crushing the weak and inexperienced for sport. I was going to show him what actual corporate ruthlessness looked like when applied by a woman who had spent decades mastering the fine art of the strategic kill. He had awakened a sleeping giant, and by the time the sun set on our wedding day, his empire would be nothing but dust. The Maybach delivered me to my modest apartment building just past midnight. I walked up the 2 flights of stairs to maintain my cover story, holding my cheap synthetic clutch. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt and immediately retrieved my encrypted laptop from a concealed floor safe under the rug. I bypassed the standard domestic wireless network and connected directly to a secure satellite uplink. Julian and I shared a domestic server for household files, but he also used it as a backup drive for his venture capital firm. He was profoundly arrogant about his cybersecurity. He firmly believed his struggling freelance accountant fiancé was too technologically illiterate to navigate anything beyond a basic spreadsheet application. He assumed I did not know what a virtual private network was or how to parse directory structures. He assumed I spent my evenings organizing grocery coupons. He was wrong, of course. I navigated through his poorly structured folders with surgical precision, bypassing his elementary password protections in less than 2 minutes. It was pathetic, really, to see how a man who touted himself as a technological visionary left his entire digital life so completely vulnerable to external intrusion. I bypassed his personal folders and navigated straight into the root directory of his corporate drive. I was looking for the fabricated invoices Dana had mentioned, but my eyes caught a newly created folder labeled Silicon Valley Acquisition Pitch. It was timestamped just 4 hours ago, right before we left for the rehearsal dinner. I opened the folder and found a massive presentation deck alongside highly detailed technical schematics and legal filings. The primary document was a drafted patent application set to be filed electronically the very next morning. Julian was attempting to patent a proprietary algorithmic trading model. He had scheduled a major pitch meeting at noon the day after our wedding to present this exact model to a massive Silicon Valley conglomerate. He was demanding a $90 million buyout and a seat on their executive board. He wanted to secure generational wealth and absolute corporate authority before the ink on our marriage certificate even had a chance to dry. I opened the technical addendum attached to the patent filing. The document contained thousands of lines of complex source code meant to prove the viability of the trading algorithm to the prospective buyers. I did not need to read the entire document to understand what I was looking at. I recognized the architecture immediately. The sequencing, the predictive market variables, the elegant loop structures that eliminated latency during high-frequency trading were all deeply familiar to me. It was not Julian's work. The code staring back at me from the encrypted screen was entirely mine. I had written the foundational architecture for this exact predictive model 7 years ago when I was first building Sterling Capital Management. It was the absolute crown jewel of my early portfolio, the mathematical engine that had generated my first $1 billion. Seeing my intellectual property pasted into his amateurish patent application felt like a physical violation. 8 months ago, Julian had come home to this tiny apartment in a state of absolute panic. He had been trying to build a predictive trading algorithm to attract institutional investors, but his code was fundamentally broken. It was leaking data and generating false market signals. He had spent weeks throwing expensive developers at the problem, but his foundational logic was flawed. I had watched him slam his fists against the kitchen table, cursing his own engineers. Playing the role of the supportive, naive girlfriend, I had offered to look at it, claiming I was good at spotting basic numerical patterns. He had laughed at me condescendingly, but left his laptop open on the kitchen island while he went to pour himself a scotch. In the 10 minutes he was out of the room, I had rewritten his entire core logic, injecting my own proprietary architecture into his broken model. When he returned, I casually pointed to the screen and asked if a specific variable was supposed to be a negative number. He looked at the screen, ran a diagnostic, and watched in stunned silence as the algorithm executed flawlessly. He actually believed he had solved it himself through some subconscious breakthrough triggered by my stupid question. He never questioned why the algorithm suddenly worked perfectly. His massive ego absorbed the success as his own innate brilliance. He was completely blind to his own limitations. But he did not just take the code to run his own small firm and generate modest returns. He was now actively attempting to patent my intellectual property under his own name and sell it to a rival corporate conglomerate for an obscene amount of money. This was an entirely different tier of betrayal from the financial theft I had uncovered earlier in the evening. Embezzling funds was a simple crime of basic human greed. Stealing my life work and attempting to legally register it as his own invention was a profound act of professional erasure. He wanted to completely eliminate my contributions and claim absolute ownership of my genius. He intended to build a massive Silicon Valley legacy, using the very code I had gifted him out of love and pity. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, staring at the stolen architecture of my own mind. A cold fury settled deep into my bones, replacing any lingering traces of affection I might have held for the man I was supposed to marry. He had overplayed his hand yet again. Because the code was mine, I knew exactly where its fatal vulnerabilities were hidden. I knew exactly how to trigger a catastrophic systemic failure from the inside. I closed the patent application and began typing a new command sequence directly into the primary source code. Julian thought he was walking into a $90 million acquisition tomorrow. He had no idea he was walking into a technological slaughterhouse of his own making. I had just finished embedding the final sequence of my proprietary blockchain lock into the stolen algorithmic code when my encrypted mobile device illuminated the dark apartment. The caller identification displayed a name that surprised me. It was Marcus Washington. Marcus was married to Julian's sister Olivia, and he was the only member of the Prescott extended family who possessed any actual merit. He was a brilliant African-American commercial real estate developer who had built a formidable portfolio of high-value properties on his own. Unlike Beatrice and Julian, who treated me like a disposable charity case, Marcus had always extended a profound level of respect toward me. He often engaged me in complex financial conversations at family dinners, treating my fabricated freelance accounting career with genuine professional courtesy. I answered the call, expecting him to ask a logistical question about the wedding schedule for tomorrow. Instead, I was met with a heavy silence, followed by a deep sigh that carried the weight of absolute disgust. "Victoria," he said, his voice uncharacteristically grim, "I am calling from my car. I left the rehearsal dinner early, and I need to tell you something that you deserve to know before you walk down that aisle tomorrow." I leaned back in my chair, closing the encrypted laptop. "Go ahead, Marcus," I replied, my tone level. "I was returning to the ballroom after taking a business call in the lobby," he explained. "I passed the coat room and heard Julian and Savannah talking. They thought the hallway was empty. Victoria, they were laughing about you. They were standing there, drinking champagne, and finalizing a plan to humiliate you in front of the entire congregation tomorrow. Julian is not planning to marry you. He is planning to stop the ceremony right at the altar to publicly dump you. He told Savannah that his lead investors want to see him act ruthlessly. He thinks leaving a supposedly broke woman at the altar will prove he possesses the cold-blooded killer instinct required to dominate the tech industry. They were treating your public destruction as a public relations stunt to boost his corporate image. I listened to this revelation without a spike in my heart rate. The sheer theatrical cruelty of Julian's plan was perfectly aligned with his inflated ego. He wanted a cinematic display of dominance. "I appreciate you telling me this, Marcus," I said smoothly. "Most brothers-in-law would protect the family bloodline and remain silent. I am not. Most people," he responded sharply. "And Julian is not just destroying you socially, Victoria. He is attempting to destroy me financially." That statement captured my full analytical attention. "What has he done, Marcus?" I asked. There was a pause on the line, as if Marcus was struggling to contain a deeply rooted rage. "You know, I have been acquiring commercial properties in the downtown tech corridor," he began. "I own those buildings through my own holding company, but I just received an automated alert from my primary lender. Julian used his position as my brother-in-law to access my corporate financial architecture. He forged my signature on a series of mezzanine loan applications. He has been quietly leveraging my commercial properties, using them as collateral to secure massive lines of credit for his venture capital firm. If his tech startups fail, the banks will foreclose on my buildings. He is risking my entire life work to fund his own pathetic delusions of grandeur. And he is using his sister as a shield, assuming I will not report him for fraud and destroy my own marriage." The pieces of Julian's systemic betrayal locked together with terrifying clarity. He was not just stealing from my secret venture capital injections. He was systematically cannibalizing the assets of anyone who trusted him. He was a financial parasite consuming the hard work of actual professionals to construct a facade of inherited brilliance. Marcus was a self-made titan who had fought tirelessly to build his real estate empire, and Julian was treating his properties like a personal slush fund. "Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute chilling authority, "you do not need to worry about the mezzanine loans or the banks foreclosing on your properties." The line was silent for a moment. "Victoria." "What do you mean?" he asked. I took a steadying breath, deciding in that exact moment to drop the carefully constructed facade. "I am not a freelance accountant, Marcus," I stated clearly. "My name is Victoria Sterling. I am the founder and sole managing director of Sterling Capital Management. I am the primary investor funding Julian's entire venture capital firm through blind proxies, and I know exactly what he has been doing because he has been routing his stolen funds directly into my corporate shell companies." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Marcus was a high-level developer. He knew exactly who Sterling Capital Management was. He knew my firm controlled the majority of the commercial real estate debt in the region. "You are Sterling Capital?" He whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a tidal wave. The poor accountant routine, it was a stress test. Yes, it was, I confirmed. And Julian has failed spectacularly. But his failure presents us with a unique operational opportunity. He thinks he's going to publicly execute my dignity tomorrow at the altar. I am going to let him try. But I need your administrative access to the church audiovisual systems. I know your firm installed them during the renovation last year. If we combine our resources tonight, we will not just stop him. We will legally and financially obliterate him in front of every single person he is trying to impress. Will you help me, Marcus? There was no hesitation at all. His response was immediate and lethal. Tell me exactly what you need, Victoria. Let us tear his empire to the ground. The morning of the massive pitch arrived with the bright clarity of a Seattle winter. Julian was pacing my living room by 6 o'clock, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit purchased with my stolen capital. He rehearsed his presentation to the mirror, his voice echoing with the manufactured confidence of a man committing grand larceny. He vibrated with anticipation of securing his $90 million buyout. I played the role of the devoted, anxious fiancé to perfection. I poured his coffee and smoothed his jacket, offering words of vacuous encouragement. He barely looked at me. His mind was consumed by the Silicon Valley billionaires he was scheduled to meet at noon. He grabbed his encrypted briefcase and walked out, leaving behind the dark blue silk tie he had chosen for the occasion. It was a calculated error, a manifestation of his frantic arrogance, but it provided the exact tactical opening I required. I waited precisely 45 minutes before calling a private car to take me to his downtown office building. Julian's venture capital firm occupied the entire 14th floor of a sleek glass tower in the financial district. The building was managed by Marcus Washington's commercial real estate holding company, a convenient logistical advantage that we had weaponized the night before. I walked through the revolving glass doors, wearing a modest beige trench coat over my cheap floral dress, clutching the forgotten silk tie in my hand. I approached the front reception desk, embodying the nervous energy of an insecure partner visiting her vastly superior future husband at his important job. The receptionist, a young woman who had clearly been instructed to filter out domestic interruptions, eyed me with thinly veiled pity. I explained that Julian had left his lucky tie at home and that he desperately needed it for his noon presentation. She sighed and picked up her phone, dialing his private extension. While she spoke, I casually shifted my weight, leaning against the marble counter. I reached into my trench coat pocket and activated my mobile device. Marcus had securely transmitted the master administrative overrides for the building's entire digital infrastructure directly to my phone. I now possessed unmitigated access to the primary servers routing through the 14th floor. The elevator doors chimed, and Julian stepped out into the lobby. He was not alone. Savannah flanked him, carrying a stack of leather-bound prospectuses. She wore a sharply tailored white crepe suit that radiated aggressive corporate ambition. Julian marched toward the reception desk, his face tight with irritation at my sudden appearance. "Victoria." "What are you doing here?" he hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting the attention of passing executives. "You know I have the most important meeting of my life in 2 hours. I cannot have you hovering around the office like a lost intern." I looked down at the floor, playing the chastised girlfriend, and held out the blue silk tie. "You left this on the kitchen counter, Julian," I said, my voice trembling with artificial timidity. "You said it was your lucky tie, and I wanted everything to be perfect for your big pitch today." He snatched the fabric from my hands without a single word of gratitude. Savannah rolled her eyes, letting out a sharp, derisive laugh. "That is so sweet, Victoria." Savannah purred, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "But Julian and I really must get back to the boardroom to finalize the algorithm deployment. We are dealing with highly complex predictive models today, and we simply do not have time for domestic errands." Julian nodded in agreement, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Go home, Victoria," he commanded. "I will call you after the acquisition is finalized." They turned their backs on me and walked confidently back toward the secure elevators. They assumed they had just dismissed an annoying minor distraction. They had no idea they had just granted me the physical proximity required to execute a fatal digital strike. I did not leave the lobby. I walked over to a quiet seating area near the floor-to-ceiling windows and sat down on a leather sofa. I pulled my device from my pocket. Because I was physically connected to the local network architecture controlled by Marcus, I was able to bypass the external firewalls shielding Julian's corporate servers. I accessed the root directory containing the patent application and the primary source code for the trading algorithm. My fingers moved across the screen with the rapid muscle memory of a woman who had built her fortune on mathematical supremacy. I did not delete his presentation or crash the servers. That would have been amateurish, and Julian would simply reschedule the meeting claiming a technical glitch. I wanted him to present the code. I wanted the Silicon Valley billionaires to see exactly how brilliant the architecture was. Instead, I embedded a geofence-triggered blockchain lock directly into the core execution logic of the algorithm. The code would function flawlessly during his local simulations. But the moment the compiled software crossed the geofenced perimeter of the building or interacted with the external market servers of the acquiring conglomerate, a dormant cryptographic watermark would instantly activate. It would permanently lock the algorithm and broadcast a verified blockchain ledger to every device in the boardroom. The ledger would irrevocably prove that the intellectual property belonged entirely to Sterling Capital Management. Julian was going to walk into that boardroom and aggressively pitch my life work to a room full of industry titans. He was going to demand $90 million for a proprietary model he claimed to have invented. And right at the pinnacle of his arrogant triumph, my code would legally and publicly identify him as a corporate thief. I finalized the sequence and locked my device. I stood up from the leather sofa, smoothed my trench coat, and walked out of the glass tower. The intellectual trap was armed, and Julian was walking straight into the jaws of a corporate slaughter. I left Julian's office tower and instructed my driver to take me directly to the Prescott ancestral estate in the upscale enclave of Mercer Island. Beatrice had summoned me for afternoon tea. The invitation was not a courtesy. It was a royal decree from a matriarch who believed she still ruled a vast financial kingdom. As my car glided up the winding cobblestone driveway, I observed the sprawling Tudor-style mansion through the tinted glass. To the untrained eye, the estate projected centuries of established wealth and unyielding prestige. The manicured ivy crawled up the imported brick, and the massive oak doors stood as a fortress of high society. But I possessed a highly trained eye. I noticed the subtle signs of deferred maintenance, the slight sagging in the slate roof, the hairline fractures in the stone retaining walls, the absence of the dedicated landscaping crew that used to groom the rhododendrons every Tuesday. The estate was a rotting museum, and Beatrice was its oblivious curator. I stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting my beige trench coat over my cheap floral dress, and approached the heavy oak doors. A household staff member who looked severely overworked ushered me into the glass-enclosed conservatory. Beatrice was already seated at a wrought iron table adorned with a vintage Wedgwood tea service. She wore a lavender cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders and a string of pearls that had likely been appraised and leveraged multiple times. She did not stand to greet me. She merely gestured to the empty wrought iron chair opposite her with a slight flick of her wrist. I took my seat, folding my hands in my lap, playing the role of the intimidated future daughter-in-law, entering the inner sanctum of the Prescott dynasty. Victoria, she began, her voice carrying that trademark aristocratic drawl designed to make the listener feel instantly inferior. I am glad you could make time in your little accounting schedule to see me. We have some important domestic matters to finalize before the ceremony this weekend. I smiled softly, projecting complete compliance. Of course, Beatrice, I replied. I want to make sure everything is perfectly aligned with your expectations for the wedding. She poured a stream of dark Earl Grey tea into a delicate bone china teacup and pushed it across the glass table toward me. She did not offer me milk or sugar. It is not just about the wedding ceremony, Victoria, she said, setting her silver teapot down with a definitive clink. It is about the reality of your integration into our family. Julian is a man of immense technological and financial importance. He carries the weight of the Prescott legacy on his shoulders. Naturally, you assume that after you exchange your vows, you will be moving into this estate to take your place as the new lady of the house. She paused, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, her eyes locked onto mine. I need to be perfectly clear with you, Victoria. That is simply not going to happen. This ancestral home is a sacred monument to our lineage. It has housed generations of Prescott executives and society leaders. It is a space reserved strictly for Prescott blood and those of equal pedigree. She set her cup down and leaned forward. You are a sweet girl, Victoria, but your background is entirely unsuitable for a property of this magnitude. You lack the ancestral context to appreciate these walls. Julian and I have decided that it would be vastly more appropriate for you to reside in a modest two-bedroom condominium downtown. It is much closer to those little bakeries you do bookkeeping for. Julian will, of course, maintain his primary residence here at the estate to handle his high-level corporate hosting duties. You will visit when appropriate. I let my shoulders slump forward slightly. I lowered my eyes, staring down at the dark amber liquid in my Wedgwood teacup. I allowed a look of profound devastation to wash over my features. I parted my lips slightly, taking a shaky breath as if I were fighting back a rising tide of tears. I channeled every ounce of artificial heartbreak I could muster, playing the crushed, naive girl who had just been banished from the castle. Beatrice thrived on this display of submission. Her posture straightened, and a look of absolute predatory satisfaction bloomed across her meticulously preserved face. She fed on the emotional destruction of women she deemed beneath her. It validated her entire hollow existence. "Do not look so sullen, Victoria," she chided, her tone dripping with false maternal sympathy. "You should be grateful Julian is even providing you with a condominium in the city. Most men of his stature would simply demand a prenuptial agreement and leave you to fend for yourself. You will have a comfortable little life. You will have your spreadsheets and your modest apartment, and you will not have to burden yourself with the massive social responsibilities of managing a historic estate. It is truly the best arrangement for everyone involved." I kept my eyes lowered, nodding slowly as if accepting my pathetic fate. "I understand, Beatrice," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound small and defeated. "I just want Julian to be happy." I raised my teacup to my lips, taking a slow sip of the hot Earl Grey. The dark liquid disguised the deadly calm smile that threatened to break across my face. Beatrice was sitting in her glass conservatory, dictating the terms of my housing arrangement with absolute imperial authority. She had no idea she was speaking to her landlord. The Prescott ancestral estate was not a monument to their lineage. It was a massive toxic liability. 2 years ago, Julian and his mother had completely depleted their inherited trust funds through a series of disastrously arrogant investments and a blatant refusal to curb their lavish spending. The estate had fallen into severe mortgage delinquency. The bank had initiated formal foreclosure proceedings and was days away from auctioning the historic property off to the highest bidder in a public fire sale. Julian had come to me in a state of absolute despair, weeping about the loss of his family honor and the impending public humiliation. I had felt a brief moment of pity for him then. I wanted to save the man I thought I loved from the devastating reality of a public eviction. So I deployed my own corporate resources. Using a blind shell company registered in Wyoming, I quietly purchased the entirety of the distressed debt from the primary commercial lender. I paid off the massive arrears in full and assumed the master mortgage. I became the sole legal lien holder of the Prescott estate. I executed this entire transaction entirely in secret to protect Julian's fragile ego. I allowed him to believe his high-priced lawyers had successfully negotiated a miraculous multi-year extension with the bank. I essentially bought the roof over Beatrice's head and let her continue playing the queen of a castle she no longer legally owned. For 2 entire years, I had been paying the exorbitant property taxes and the massive structural insurance premiums out of my own pocket, while Beatrice sat in this very conservatory, judging my off-the-rack clothing and mocking my fabricated poverty. I placed my teacup gently back onto its matching bone china saucer. I reached into my trench coat pocket and retrieved my mobile phone. "Excuse me, Beatrice," I said, my tone still soft and entirely compliant. "I just need to silence my notifications. I do not want any of my accounting clients to interrupt our important conversation." She waved her hand dismissively, clearly bored now that she had successfully crushed my spirit and established her dominance. "Go ahead, Victoria," she said, picking up a small silver bell to summon her overworked housekeeper. "Just be quick about it." I held the mobile device under the glass table out of her direct line of sight. I did not silence my notifications. I opened a secure encrypted messaging application linked directly to my senior real estate litigation team. The intellectual trap was fully prepared. Because Julian had signed that predatory prenuptial agreement linking his personal liability directly to his corporate fraud, he had technically triggered an irrevocable default clause in the blind mortgage I held on the estate. The property was legally forfeit and the grace period had expired. I typed a rapid, highly specific command to my lead attorney. I authorized them to initiate the final eviction protocols immediately. I set the precise execution timeline. The county sheriffs were to arrive at the wrought iron gates of the Prescott ancestral estate at exactly 9 o'clock on the morning of our wedding. They were strictly instructed to change the exterior locks, seize the valuable physical assets, and serve Beatrice with a mandatory legal notice to vacate the premises within 24 hours. I hit send. The message encrypted and vanished, initiating an unstoppable legal avalanche. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked up at Beatrice. She was adjusting her vintage pearl necklace, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire ancestral legacy had just been legally vaporized by the very woman she was trying to banish. "Thank you for the tea, Beatrice," I said, my voice returning to its normal, steady cadence. "You have given me a tremendous amount of clarity regarding my future living arrangements. I cannot wait for the wedding day. It is going to be unforgettable." My driver navigated the Maybach away from the decaying Prescott estate and merged onto the highway heading back toward the Seattle skyline. I left Beatrice sitting in her glass conservatory, completely unaware that the countdown to her absolute eviction had already begun. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I stepped out of the private elevator on the top floor of the Sterling Capital Management Tower. The transition from the oppressive artificiality of Mercer Island to the sleek functional power of my own corporate headquarters was instantly centering. I walked past the minimalist reception desk and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of my primary boardroom. The room offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Puget Sound, but my attention was focused entirely on the highly trained individuals seated around the massive polished walnut table. My senior legal counsel had assembled exactly as I instructed. Rachel Morrison, the most feared corporate litigator in the Pacific Northwest, sat at the head of the table, reviewing a stack of dense legal filings alongside my lead forensic accountant, Dana. They both looked up as I entered the room. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, placing my encrypted tablet on the smooth wood surface. "Good afternoon, Victoria," Rachel said, her voice carrying the sharp authoritative edge that made rival executives sweat during high-stakes depositions. "We have fully analyzed the prenuptial agreement your fiancé forced you to sign last night at the country club." I steepled my fingers, resting my elbows on the armrests of my leather executive chair. "And the reciprocal liability clause?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. Rachel offered a rare predatory smile. "It is an absolute masterpiece of arrogant incompetence," she replied. "Julian's downtown corporate lawyers were so focused on protecting his fabricated tech empire from your supposedly empty bank accounts that they relied entirely on an aggressive boilerplate template. They included a mutual indemnification and liability clause designed to prevent you from attaching any hidden domestic debts to his pristine corporate ledgers. But because they used identical reciprocal language, they legally bound him to the exact same standard. By signing that document last night, you did not surrender your rights, Victoria. You legally activated a mirror that reflects all corporate liability directly back onto the individual who incurred it. Julian thought he was building an impenetrable fortress around his assets. He did not realize he was locking himself inside a burning building. I opened my encrypted tablet, projecting the financial schematics onto the large monitor at the end of the long boardroom. Dana has already confirmed that Julian used our retail joint checking account to funnel stolen venture capital directly into a dormant limited liability company owned by my firm. I explained to the room. He committed federal wire fraud and pierced his own corporate veil in the process. Now I need to ensure that when the massive financial avalanche hits, there is absolutely no legal maneuver he can use to shield his personal wealth or claim bankruptcy protection under his tech firm. Rachel nodded, pulling a thick bound document from her leather briefcase. "That is exactly why we are restructuring your revocable living trust today," she stated, sliding the paperwork across the walnut table toward me. "We are moving all of your primary holding companies, including the dormant entity Julian unwittingly used for his laundering scheme, into a newly established, irrevocable trust structure. This effectively removes the assets from your direct personal ownership, isolating them from any marital disputes or community property claims he might attempt to leverage during the upcoming divorce proceedings. But more importantly, it establishes Sterling Capital Management as an entirely separate legal victim of his blatant embezzlement. I picked up the solid gold Cartier fountain pen I had used to sign the prenuptial agreement the night before. I uncapped it and prepared to sign the trust restructuring documents. By establishing the firm as the primary victim and utilizing the reciprocal liability clause in the prenup, he demanded we are executing a flawless legal maneuver. I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute chilling finality. We are legally binding every single fraudulent debt, every stolen dollar, and every illicit wire transfer directly to Julian's personal social security number. Rachel leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Exactly, she confirmed. His limited liability company protections are completely dissolved by his own actions and his own arrogant signatures. The moment he stands at that altar tomorrow and attempts to publicly humiliate you, the automated digital triggers will instantly notify the federal authorities. Because the immense financial debt is securely bound to his specific personal social security number, the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission will immediately seize his personal bank accounts, his luxury vehicles, and that new penthouse he purchased with his mistress. He will not be able to hide behind any corporate bankruptcy filings. The American justice system will strip him down to his absolute foundation, leaving him entirely destitute. He will face the full unforgiving weight of federal prosecution without a single dollar to hire competent defense counsel. His arrogance sealed his fate, and his greed wrote the indictment. I signed the complex trust documents with a steady, deliberate hand. The dark ink flowed smoothly across the heavy paper, locking the final piece of the massive financial web into place. I capped the Cartier pen, placing it next to the executed contracts with a satisfying metallic click. Julian had spent 5 long years treating me like a disposable accessory, assuming my quiet demeanor was a symptom of intellectual weakness. He believed his superficial charm and aggressive posturing made him an apex predator in the ruthless corporate world. He assumed that because I wore off the rack clothing, I lacked the vision to outmaneuver him. He had no idea he was dealing with a woman who built entire financial empires for a living and crushed men like him before breakfast. The board meeting concluded with quiet professional efficiency. The legal snares were meticulously set. The financial traps were fully armed. The entire systemic architecture of his destruction was perfectly calibrated and ready to detonate. All I had to do now was put on a white wedding dress and walk down the aisle. The highly anticipated morning of the wedding finally arrived with a crisp and bitter Seattle chill that perfectly mirrored the cold temperature of my own blood. I sat in the penthouse suite of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Julian believed I was getting ready in the cramped bathroom of my fake one-bedroom apartment. In reality, I had secured the most exclusive suite in the city weeks ago under my corporate account. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the downtown skyline, where my firm controlled a vast majority of the commercial real estate. A soft knock at the heavy mahogany door interrupted my quiet contemplation. My private security detail stepped into the room carrying a small velvet box. He informed me that a courier had just dropped it off with strict instructions that it be delivered directly to the bride from the mother of the groom. I dismissed the guard and placed the box on the polished marble vanity. I knew exactly what Beatrice was doing. She could not resist the opportunity to deliver one final psychological blow before she believed I was permanently subjugated. I opened the velvet lid. Resting on a bed of cheap synthetic satin was a gaudy cubic zirconian necklace. The metal was a flimsy base alloy painted to look like white gold, and the stones caught the morning light with the harsh, artificial glare of mass-produced costume jewelry. A small card was tucked beneath the chain bearing Beatrice's elegant looping handwriting. It read simply, "For Victoria, so you do not look entirely out of place among our kind today." I did not feel a single flicker of anger or humiliation. I felt nothing but a profound clinical amusement. Beatrice was clinging to the illusion of her superiority with the desperate grip of a drowning woman. She was gifting fake diamonds to a billionaire while sitting in an ancestral estate that was currently surrounded by county sheriffs executing my foreclosure orders. I left the cubic zirconia necklace sitting in its velvet box on the vanity. It was a fitting monument to the Prescott legacy, entirely artificial and completely devoid of any actual value. I turned away from the mirror and walked toward the master bedroom where my real wedding attire awaited. Julian and his mother expected me to walk down the aisle in a discount bridal gown picked from a clearance rack. Instead, my wardrobe team carefully unzipped a protective garment bag to reveal a custom Dior haute couture gown. I had flown to Paris 3 months ago for the private fittings using a corporate jet Julian did not know I owned. The dress was a masterpiece of architectural silk and structural lace designed to project absolute power and unyielding grace. It was not the dress of a naive girl hoping to be saved. It was the armor of a reigning matriarch preparing for a public execution. My stylist worked in absolute silence, pinning my hair into a flawless severe chignon that exposed the sharp angles of my jawline. As they secured the final silk-covered buttons running down the spine of the gown, I reached into my personal secure travel safe. I bypassed the combination lock and retrieved a heavy mahogany jewel case. Inside rested my late grandmother's flawless emerald tennis bracelet. The stones were deeply saturated Colombian emeralds set in heavy antique platinum. It was a genuine heritage piece carrying decades of authentic wealth and the unbreakable strength of the women in my lineage. It was the exact opposite of the hollow cubic zirconia Beatrice had sent. I fastened the heavy platinum clasp around my left wrist, feeling the cold weight of the emeralds against my pulse. My heartbeat remained a steady, resting 60 beats per minute. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The image staring back at me was terrifyingly calm. I wore no veil. I refused to hide my face or obscure my vision for even a single second. The silent transition was complete. The struggling freelance accountant was officially dead, and Victoria Sterling, the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Capital Management, had fully emerged. I picked up my phone and sent one final encrypted message to Marcus Washington, confirming that the audiovisual overrides at the cathedral were fully operational and standing by. He replied instantly with a single confirmation code. The systemic architecture of Julian's destruction was now entirely locked into place. My lead corporate litigator, Rachel Morrison, entered the suite wearing a sharp black suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase containing the executed trust documents and the finalized federal wire fraud referrals. She looked at my reflection in the mirror and offered a curt, approving nod. "The trap is armed, Victoria," she stated, her voice carrying the lethal efficiency of a seasoned courtroom predator. "The federal agents are positioned outside the cathedral perimeters, and the digital transfer locks will trigger the moment he begins his public speech." I picked up my bridal bouquet of stark white calla lilies. Their rigid architectural lines perfectly matched the Dior gown. "I am ready, Rachel," I replied, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "Let us go give Julian the unforgettable cinematic event he so desperately wants." We exited the penthouse suite and descended to the private underground garage, where the armored Maybach was waiting with the engine running. I stepped into the spacious cabin, the heavy door sealing me inside a vault of quiet anticipation. The smooth and quiet drive to the historic downtown cathedral took exactly 14 minutes. I watched the city streets blur past the tinted glass, knowing that Julian was currently standing at the altar congratulating himself on his brilliant deception. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He believed he was the apex predator waiting to devour a helpless victim. He had absolutely no idea that the legal slaughter was imminent, and he was the one being led blindly and directly to the ultimate execution block. The heavy oak doors of the historic downtown cathedral groaned as they swung open, revealing a cavernous sanctuary bathed in the fractured light of massive stained glass windows. The Seattle elite packed the wooden pews shoulder to shoulder. Julian and Beatrice had curated the guest list with aggressive precision, ensuring that every influential venture capitalist, every prominent real estate developer, and every major socialite in the Pacific Northwest was in attendance to witness the pinnacle of the Prescott family resurgence. The air inside the cathedral was thick with the scent of imported white orchids and the quiet murmurs of a high society crowd waiting for a spectacle. I stood in the vestibule, listening to the opening chords of the organ reverberating through the stone arches. I did not feel the nervous flutter of a traditional bride. I felt the cold metallic certainty of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. My custom Dior haute couture gown brushed against the polished stone floor with a heavy, luxurious rustle. The pristine white silk and rigid architectural lace projected an aura of absolute unyielding authority. The heavy platinum and emerald tennis bracelet rested securely against my left wrist, a silent testament to my genuine ancestral wealth. I stepped over the threshold and began my slow, deliberate march down the central aisle. Hundreds of heads turned to watch my progression. I kept my face sculpted into a mask of serene composure. My eyes remained fixed on the altar, refusing to acknowledge the pitying glances from Beatrice's country club friends or the dismissive stares from the tech investors sitting in the prime front rows. They all believed they were watching a naive, financially destitute accountant taking the longest walk of her life toward a miraculous elevation in social status. They thought my calm demeanor was simply the shock of a woman overwhelmed by her own unearned good fortune. I let them hold on to their arrogant delusions for a few final moments. I observed the intricate details of the cathedral architecture, noticing the exact placement of the audio-visual projection screens Marcus Washington had subtly integrated into the Gothic pillars. The digital snare was perfectly concealed and waiting for my command. Julian stood at the end of the long aisle waiting for me on the elevated marble altar. He wore a tailored midnight blue tuxedo that accentuated his broad shoulders and his manufactured posture of dominance. A smug, triumphant smile played across his lips. He looked past me, making brief, deliberate eye contact with Savannah, who was seated in the second row, wearing a highly inappropriate scarlet dress and the diamond tennis bracelet he had purchased with my stolen capital. Julian then shifted his gaze to the front row where the Silicon Valley billionaires were seated. He gave them a subtle, confident nod, signaling that he was in complete control of the narrative. He believed he was the master of this grand theater. He had no idea he was merely an actor reading lines from a script I had already rewritten and finalized. I reached the altar and handed my rigid bouquet of white calla lilies to a terrified-looking bridesmaid. I stepped up to stand directly across from Julian. The presiding priest, an older man with a gentle voice and a heavy gold vestment, began the traditional invocation. The ancient words echoed through the massive stone sanctuary, speaking of eternal partnership, mutual respect, and unwavering loyalty. The sheer hypocrisy of the ceremony hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Julian maintained his arrogant smirk, his eyes darting toward the venture capitalists in the front row, checking to ensure they were paying close attention to his performance. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped together, maintaining my steady resting heart rate. I was a predator sitting in absolute stillness, waiting for the prey to confidently step over the tripwire. The priest concluded the opening prayers and moved to the central question of the ceremony. He looked at Julian, asking if he was prepared to take me as his lawfully wedded wife to honor and protect me through all of life's trials. This was the precise moment Julian had been planning for weeks. Instead of saying "I do," Julian raised his right hand in a sharp, authoritative gesture, stopping the priest mid-sentence. A sudden, heavy silence crashed down over the packed cathedral. The organ music abruptly ceased. 200 wealthy guests held their collective breath, shifting uncomfortably in the wooden pews. The priest looked at Julian with profound confusion, lowering his ceremonial book. Julian did not look at the priest, and he did not look at me. He turned his body completely away from the altar, facing the congregation, and specifically targeting the front rows where the billionaire investors were seated. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket, projecting the cold, calculated aura of a ruthless tech industry titan, preparing to make a difficult but necessary corporate termination. "Thank you all for gathering here today." Julian began, his voice booming through the cathedral sound system with rehearsed theatrical resonance. When you are building an empire, you are constantly forced to evaluate your investments and make difficult executive decisions. You must possess the clarity to recognize when a partnership is no longer viable, and the ruthless instinct to sever ties before that partnership drags your legacy down into mediocrity. He paced slowly across the marble steps, commanding the room exactly as he had planned with Savannah in the courtroom the night before. He pointed a dismissive finger in my general direction without actually looking at my face. "Victoria is a sweet girl," he continued, his tone dripping with toxic condescension. "She's a simple accountant who balances ledgers for small businesses. But a man carrying the weight of the Prescott name and the future of a massive technological conglomerate cannot afford to be tethered to a woman who possesses absolutely no ambition, no strategic vision, and no pedigree. I need a true equal to stand beside me at the summit of the industry. I cannot compromise my future or the future of my firm out of misplaced charity. Therefore, I am officially calling off this wedding effective immediately. The congregation erupted into a cacophony of shocked gasps and frantic whispering. Beatrice placed a hand over her heart, feigning surprise while nodding in vigorous agreement with her son's brutal assessment. Savannah smiled broadly, leaning forward in her pew to watch my anticipated destruction. Julian finally turned back to face me, folding his arms across his chest. He stood there, basking in the glow of his own perceived ruthlessness, fully expecting me to collapse onto the marble floor in a puddle of humiliated tears. He expected me to beg for his mercy in front of the entire Seattle elite. He expected a total psychological surrender. He stared at me, waiting for the breakdown that would validate his entire cruel narrative and cement his reputation as a cold-blooded corporate killer. Julian stood there on the elevated marble altar, breathing heavily as the echo of his cruel announcement faded into the cavernous ceiling of the cathedral. He squared his broad shoulders, adjusting the lapels of his midnight blue tuxedo, and waited for my inevitable collapse. He expected me to drop to my knees and weep into the pristine white silk of my custom Dior gown. He wanted the venture capitalists in the front row to witness my total psychological destruction so they could applaud his cold-blooded executive instincts. The silence in the sanctuary became absolute and suffocating. 200 members of the Seattle elite held their breath, watching the struggling freelance accountant absorb the ultimate public humiliation. Beatrice leaned forward in her pew, clutching her vintage pearl necklace, her eyes wide with predatory excitement. Savannah sat directly behind the billionaire investors, her crimson dress a blatant insult, flashing a triumphant smile as she stroked the stolen diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. I did not drop to my knees. I did not shed a single tear. I maintained my resting heart rate of exactly 60 beats per minute. I looked at Julian with an expression of profound clinical detachment. The sheer absence of my suffering confused him. His arrogant smirk wavered as his brain struggled to process my unnatural composure. I reached into the concealed structural seam of my haute couture gown and retrieved my encrypted mobile device. I did not scream or raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, deadly calm that carried perfectly through the acoustics of the historic stone building. "Are you quite finished, Julian?" I asked, my tone slicing through the heavy silence like a diamond-tipped scalpel. The congregation gasped at the chilling authority in my voice. Julian blinked, his manufactured confidence cracking as he opened his mouth to deliver another rehearsed line about corporate necessity. I did not allow him to speak another word. I tapped a single command sequence onto the screen of my device, instantly triggering the master overrides. Marcus Washington had embedded into the cathedral audio-visual network. Massive high-definition projection screens seamlessly descended from the Gothic arches flanking the altar. The sudden mechanical whirring shattered the tension in the room. The brilliant white light of the projectors illuminated the shocked faces of the congregation. Julian spun around, staring up at the massive displays in total bewilderment. He patted his pockets as if searching for a remote control, demanding to know who was operating the system. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us until I stood exactly in the center of the altar, commanding the attention of the entire room. "My name is not just Victoria," I announced, my voice now perfectly amplified by the hidden lapel microphone I had integrated into my gown earlier that morning, "and I am certainly not a struggling freelance accountant." I turned my gaze from Julian to the venture capitalists sitting in the front pews, making direct, sustained eye contact with the very billionaires he had been trying to impress. "I am Victoria Sterling," I stated clearly. "I am the founder and sole managing director of Sterling Capital Management." A synchronized wave of shock crashed over the elite crowd. The whispering exploded into a chaotic roar. The men in the front row sat bolt upright, their expressions shifting from polite boredom to absolute stunned recognition. Every major player in the Pacific Northwest financial sector knew the name Sterling Capital Management. They knew it was the apex predator of the commercial real estate and venture capital markets. Beatrice dropped her imported silk fan, her jaw falling open in a grotesque mask of horror as the reality of my identity struck her. Savannah stopped smiling, her hand freezing over her stolen diamonds. Julian stood paralyzed, staring at me as if I had just morphed into a terrifying mythical creature. He shook his head frantically, taking a step backward. "That is impossible," he stammered, his voice stripped of its deep theatrical resonance, sounding thin and desperate. "You balance ledgers for bakeries. You live in a one-bedroom apartment." I offered him a smile entirely devoid of warmth. "I lived in a one-bedroom apartment because I wanted to see what kind of man you were without the intoxicating influence of my portfolio," I explained with surgical precision. "I wanted a partner who valued my intellect over my net worth. But you failed the test, Julian. You failed it the moment I decided to artificially fund your pathetic delusion of a tech empire." I tapped my screen again. The massive projection screens behind us flashed, illuminating the dark cathedral with highly detailed securities and exchange commission filings and complex corporate flowcharts. I directed the attention of the stunned billionaires to the undeniable data. The firm Julian claims to have built with his own ruthless genius is nothing more than a heavily subsidized subsidiary of my holding company, I declared, projecting my voice over the rising murmurs. If you look at the blind proxy structures displayed behind me, you will see the exact routing numbers for the Series A and Series B funding rounds that sustained his failing enterprise. I am his sole majority investor. I provided every single dollar he has ever managed. I bought the bespoke suits he is wearing today. I leased the luxury vehicles he drives. And I paid for the exorbitant lifestyle that convinced you all he was a self-made titan. Julian turned pale, his skin taking on a sickening grey pallor as he stared at his own financial records displayed in 50-foot high resolution. The venture capitalists in the front row immediately began pulling out their own phones, furiously messaging their legal teams as they realized they had been negotiating with a complete fraud. But the systemic deception does not end with my artificially injected capital. I continued seamlessly transitioning to the next phase of his public execution. I tapped the screen and a new set of documents appeared. These were the forged mezzanine loan applications and the commercial property deeds belonging to Marcus Washington. I looked directly at Marcus, who was standing near the back of the sanctuary, his arms crossed in quiet solidarity. Julian has been quietly leveraging his own brother-in-law's commercial real estate empire, forging executive signatures to secure massive lines of credit without consent, I announced. He was risking the ancestral wealth and the hard-earned legacy of his own family members to prop up his failing tech startups. He is not a visionary. He's a financial parasite who consumes the brilliant work of the people closest to him. The murmurs in the cathedral escalated into open hostility. The socialite crowd that had been ready to applaud my destruction was now collectively turning on the man standing at the altar. But the final layer of my presentation was reserved for the ultimate intellectual humiliation. I advanced the projection to the final slide. The screens filled with thousands of lines of complex predictive source code. Alongside a heavily redacted patent application, Julian let out a strangled gasp, physically recoiling from the image. This morning, Julian walked into a boardroom to pitch a proprietary, algorithmic trading model to a Silicon Valley conglomerate. I told the crowd, focusing my attention entirely on the tech investors who had flown in specifically for this acquisition. He demanded a $90 million buyout for this software. He aggressively claimed he had authored the architecture himself. I took a slow, measured step toward Julian, my Dior gown rustling heavily against the marble. But Julian is not a coder, and he is certainly not a mathematical genius. He is a project manager who stole a broken piece of software from my personal laptop and assumed I was too simple-minded to understand the theft. The code displayed on these screens is my intellectual property. I authored the foundational logic 7 years ago. The venture capitalists leaned forward, studying the architecture displayed on the screens. They were seasoned engineers and analysts. They could immediately recognize the sheer elegance and the unparalleled predictive capability of the programming. They also recognized that Julian was entirely incapable of producing such a masterpiece. I knew he was going to present my code to the buyers today. I continued, my voice ringing with cold, unyielding pride. So yesterday, while playing the role of his doting, oblivious fiancé, I accessed his root directory and embedded a geofence-triggered blockchain watermark directly into the core execution logic. When Julian compiled the software for his presentation this morning, the code functioned flawlessly. But the moment it interacted with the external market servers, it permanently locked the algorithm and broadcast a verified cryptographic ledger to every device in his boardroom. I tapped my phone one final time. The projection screens zoomed in on the specific lines of code, highlighting the undeniable digital watermark that flashed across the screen in bold red typography. The watermark clearly read, Sterling Capital Management, irrevocable intellectual property. Julian collapsed onto the marble steps of the altar. His legs simply gave out beneath the crushing weight of his absolute exposure. He knelt there in his tailored tuxedo, a broken fraud staring up at the irrefutable evidence of his intellectual theft. He had tried to erase my contributions and claim my life work as his own legacy. He had attempted to humiliate me to secure his position as an apex predator in the corporate world. Instead, I had systematically dismantled his entire identity in front of every single person he had ever wanted to impress. I looked down at him feeling no pity and no remorse. I had successfully reclaimed my throne and entirely obliterated his artificial empire without ever raising my voice. His public execution was now an absolute and irreversible reality. The architectural precision of my strategic vengeance left him with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Julian remained paralyzed on the marble steps of the altar, his chest heaving as the reality of his total exposure crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. He scrambled to his feet, his tailored tuxedo suddenly looking less like the armor of a tech titan and more like the uniform of a desperate imposter. He raised his hands toward the venture capitalists in the front row, stammering incoherently about misunderstandings and rogue algorithms. He tried to project authority, but his voice cracked, fracturing into a pathetic, high-pitched plea for patience. The billionaires simply stared back at him with absolute contempt, already dialing their wealth management teams to sever all financial ties to the Prescott name. Beatrice was hyperventilating in her pew, clutching her pearls as if they could somehow shield her from the impending social ruin Savannah had already pushed past, the stunned guests making a frantic retreat toward the side exit. I stood perfectly still, watching his entire artificial empire collapse with the cold clinical detachment of a led prosecutor, observing a final guilty verdict. I did not need to interrupt his pathetic scrambling, because the final consequence of his arrogance was already marching up the cathedral steps. The massive oak doors at the back of the sanctuaries swung open with a heavy, resonant thud that silenced the chaotic murmurs of the elite congregation. 4 individuals dressed in sharp dark suits stepped over the threshold, moving with the synchronized and undeniable authority of federal law enforcement. The gold shields clipped to their belts caught the light cascading through the stained glass windows. They were special agents from the white-collar crimes division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agents walked deliberately down the central aisle, their footsteps echoing rhythmically against the polished stone floor. The Seattle socialites and Silicon Valley investors immediately parted, creating a wide, clear path to the altar. Julian turned slowly to face the approaching federal agents, his skin draining of all remaining color until he looked entirely ghostly. He stumbled backward, gripping the heavy wooden pulpit for immediate physical support. "Victoria, what is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, unvarnished terror. I stepped forward, ensuring my voice carried through the lapel microphone so every person in the cathedral could hear the exact mechanics of his financial execution. "This is the culmination of your own exceptional greed, Julian," I stated clearly. "When you decided to steal from the very venture capital funds I secretly provided, you made a series of catastrophic logistical errors. You assumed I was a mathematically illiterate freelance accountant who would never notice millions of dollars moving through our modest retail joint checking account. You assumed you could use that domestic account as a personal laundering machine to funnel stolen capital into a dormant limited liability company, you thought. You were a financial mastermind, utilizing a corporate shell to hide your illicit wealth, but the entity you chose to hijack was Apex Holdings, a subsidiary entirely owned and operated by Sterling Capital Management. By routing stolen funds through domestic banking channels into my own corporate architecture, you did not just steal from me. You automatically triggered severe federal wire fraud flags across multiple institutional monitoring systems. Julian shook his head frantically, his eyes darting between me and the federal agents who were now ascending the marble steps of the altar. "But I am protected," he stammered, his voice pitching higher with every word. "My lawyers structured the firm to shield me. The corporate veil protects my personal assets from any institutional liability." I offered him a smile of absolute chilling finality. The corporate veil would have protected you if you had not deliberately pierced it yourself. I corrected him with surgical precision. When you mixed stolen corporate funds with our personal domestic accounts, you instantly dissolved those limited liability protections. But you guaranteed your own absolute destruction last night at the rehearsal dinner. You were so desperate to protect your fabricated empire from my supposed poverty that you forced me to sign a predatory prenuptial agreement. You demanded I execute that document to prove I was not a gold digger. But your aggressive corporate lawyers relied on a boilerplate template that included a mutual indemnification and reciprocal liability clause. By forcing my signature, you legally bound any fraudulent corporate debt or illicit wire transfers directly to your personal social security number. You completely bypassed your own corporate protections. You handed the federal government the exact legal mechanism required to strip you of every single asset you possess. You are entirely personally liable for the millions of dollars you embezzled, and the federal authorities do not offer bankruptcy protection for intentional wire fraud. The lead federal agent stepped onto the altar, stopping just inches from Julian. The agent did not raise his voice or offer any dramatic preamble. He simply looked at Julian with the cold efficiency of a man executing a routine mandate. Julian Prescott, the agent, stated, his voice carrying absolute unquestionable authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the interstate transfer of illicit funds." Julian did not resist. He simply collapsed inward, entirely broken by the sheer architectural perfection of the trap he had built for himself. The agent secured the heavy steel handcuffs around Julian's wrists, the sharp metallic click echoing loudly through the silent cathedral. Julian lowered his head, his tailored bespoke tuxedo wrinkling as the agents forcefully turned him around. He was no longer a visionary tech titan or an elite venture capitalist. He was just another common thief being escorted off the premises in front of every single billionaire he had ever tried to impress. I stood there in my custom Dior gown, watching the federal agents lead my former fiancé down the aisle and out of the heavy oak doors. The trap was sprung. The public execution was absolutely flawless. The parasite was finally removed from my legacy and my empire. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral slammed shut behind the federal agents, taking Julian away, and the resonating echo plunged the sanctuary into a suffocating silence. The immediate aftermath of his arrest hung in the air like a localized vacuum, absorbing all the manufactured prestige the Prescott family had spent decades cultivating. The silence was suddenly shattered by the sharp, frantic clicking of heels against the polished stone floor. Beatrice Prescott could no longer maintain her carefully constructed mask of aristocratic superiority. The illusion of her dynasty had just been publicly vaporized, and her mind simply could not process the absolute financial annihilation she was witnessing. She marched down the central aisle toward the elevated marble altar, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The lavender cashmere cardigan slipped from her shoulders and fell onto the floor, completely ignored and trampled under her own feet. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at me, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical scream that completely violated the sacred acoustics of the historic building. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her words bouncing off the vaulted ceilings with frantic desperation. "How dare you come into our world and orchestrate this malicious spectacle? You are nothing but a classless, vindictive little accountant playing dress-up in clothes you probably rented. You have destroyed my son. I will personally see to it that you are completely ruined." I will utilize every single contact I possess in this city to destroy your fabricated firm. Now get off this altar and get off Prescott property before I have my private security arrest you for trespassing." I looked down at the furious matriarch from my elevated position on the altar. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I merely adjusted my stance, the heavy silk of my custom Dior gown settling around me like impenetrable armor. Beatrice was clinging to the very last shred of her delusional reality, invoking the power of the Prescott name as if it still held any actual currency in this city. She firmly believed she was standing on sovereign family ground. I looked down at the rigid bridal bouquet of white calla lilies resting on the marble balustrade where I had placed them earlier. I reached into the structural binding of the floral arrangement, bypassing the delicate petals, and withdrew 2 thick, folded legal documents. I descended the 3 marble steps with deliberate, measured grace until I stood directly in front of her. I held the heavy vellum papers out in my hand. Beatrice stared at them, her chest heaving heavily, refusing to extend her arm to take them. "These are not my wedding vows, Beatrice," I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that forced the surrounding elite guests to lean forward in their wooden pews just to hear the execution. "This top document is a certified quitclaim deed, and the bottom document is an expedited notice of foreclosure." I tucked the crisp papers directly into her trembling hands, forcing her fingers to close around them. "You just demanded that I get off Prescott property." I continued, my tone perfectly conversational and entirely devoid of empathy. "But the fundamental flaw in your aggressive demand is that there is absolutely no such thing as Prescott property anymore. This historic cathedral was completely financially destitute 3 years ago. The diocese was preparing to sell the land to the commercial real estate developers to cover their massive operating deficits. Sterling Capital Management purchased the building and the surrounding real estate through a private preservation trust. I own this sanctuary entirely. Furthermore, the Prescott Country Club, where you delivered your profoundly humiliating toast last night, was acquired by my private equity division 6 months ago, when their membership dues failed to cover their own impending insolvency. I own the venue where you tried to break my spirit, and I own the very ground you are standing on right now." Beatrice looked down at the legal documents in her hands, her eyes frantically scanning the bold, indisputable text. Her face lost whatever remaining color it had taken on the pale, translucent quality of a ghost, realizing it no longer belonged in the physical world. "But the final layer of your eviction is much more systemic and far more personal," I said, taking 1/2 step closer to ensure my words landed with maximum psychological devastation. 2 years ago, when your extravagant spending finally collided with your completely depleted trust funds, the primary commercial bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on your ancestral estate in Mercer Island. Julian came to my tiny apartment, weeping uncontrollably about the loss of your family legacy and the impending public humiliation of being thrown out onto the street. I took pity on the man I thought I loved. I deployed a blind shell company registered in Wyoming to quietly purchase your distressed debt from the commercial lender. I paid off your massive arrears in full, and I assumed the master mortgage. I essentially bought the roof over your head, and I allowed you to continue playing the arrogant queen of a castle you no longer legally owned. For 2 entire years, I have been quietly paying your exorbitant property taxes and your massive structural insurance premiums out of my own pocket while you sat in your glass conservatory, mocking my fabricated poverty and lecturing me about my lack of pedigree. Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. She was actively suffocating under the crushing weight of her own absolute irrelevance. But because Julian was so desperate to protect his stolen wealth, he forced me to sign that predatory prenuptial agreement last night. I explained, keeping my voice perfectly steady and analytical. By executing that specific document, he legally bound his personal liability directly to his corporate fraud. That careless legal action technically triggered an irrevocable default clause in the blind mortgage I currently hold on your estate. The property is officially legally forfeit, and the standard grace period has completely expired. At this exact moment, the county sheriffs are stationed at the wrought iron gates of your Mercer Island home. They are actively changing the exterior locks. They are seizing your valuable physical assets to cover the remaining debt, and they are executing a mandatory legal notice to vacate the premises within 24 hours. You are officially evicted, Beatrice. You have absolutely nowhere to go, and you have zero financial resources to secure new housing. Your ancestral lineage cannot pay a security deposit. You are completely and utterly destitute. Beatrice swayed on her feet, the legal documents slipping from her numb fingers and scattering across the polished stone floor like dead leaves. She looked around the massive cathedral, silently pleading with her high society friends and fellow country club members for support or intervention. But the Seattle elite are profoundly pragmatic when it comes to shifting power dynamics and financial contagion. They recognize a sinking ship, and they ruthlessly cut their ties to avoid being dragged under the surface. Every single socialite and venture capitalist in the room immediately averted their eyes, refusing to meet her desperate pleading gaze. They were already rapidly repositioning their loyalty toward the true apex predator standing on the altar. The heavy silence was broken by the sound of confident, measured footsteps. Marcus Washington emerged from the back of the sanctuary and walked purposefully down the central aisle. He moved with the undeniable, unyielding authority of a brilliant African-American commercial real estate developer who had built his massive empire through sheer intellect and relentless grit, representing a stark contrast to the decaying inherited privilege of the Prescotts. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his expression a mask of serious, focused determination. Marcus stepped onto the altar and took his place directly at my right side, physically and symbolically flanking me against the pathetic remnants of the Prescott family. He looked down at Beatrice with an expression of profound, unapologetic disgust. "You and your son treated my commercial properties like a personal slush fund," Marcus stated, his deep voice resonating with absolute clarity through the cathedral acoustics. Julian quietly leveraged the hard-earned legacy of my family and forged my signature to prop up his pathetic delusions of grandeur. He thought he could exploit my trust and hide behind the convenient excuse of family loyalty to steal my equity. But true loyalty requires mutual honor, and the Prescotts possess absolutely none of it. Marcus then turned his attention away from the ruined matriarch and addressed the billionaire investors who were still seated in the front rows, actively processing the massive shift in corporate leadership. For those of you who were prepared to invest your capital in the fraudulent technology Julian presented this morning, I strongly advise you to redirect your portfolios, Marcus announced, commanding the entire room with effortless executive presence. As of this morning, the operational framework and the valid technological assets of Julian's former venture capital firm have been entirely absorbed by Sterling Capital Management. I am officially stepping in as the new lead executive of the restructured technology division operating under Victoria's direct oversight. We will be executing a comprehensive forensic purge of all compromised assets and moving forward strictly with legitimate, verified intellectual property. My commercial real estate holdings remain completely secure, and our newly formed joint enterprise will dominate the sector without the toxic liability of the Prescott name dragging us down into the mud. The venture capitalists nodded in immediate unanimous agreement, visibly relieved to be dealing with a proven, competent executive team rather than a chaotic amateur fraudster. Marcus and I had formed an unbreakable alliance forged in the fires of systemic betrayal. Together, we represented an unstoppable coalition of legitimate wealth, strategic brilliance, and unwavering professional honor. Beatrice finally collapsed her knees, giving out completely. She sank onto the hard, cold stone floor of the cathedral she no longer owned, surrounded by the scattered foreclosure documents. She buried her face in her trembling hands, letting out a hollow, broken sob that echoed pitifully through the vast, empty space above us. She was sitting in the shattered ruins of her aristocratic illusions, left with nothing but the crushing reality of her own monumental arrogance. I looked down at her one last time, feeling absolutely no sympathy and zero regret. I had simply returned the exact hostile energy they had directed at me, amplified exponentially by the unforgiving machinery of the American justice system. I turned away from the weeping matriarch and looked at Marcus. He offered me a deeply respectful, confirming nod. I reached down, gathering the heavy silk train of my Dior gown, and began walking back down the central aisle. I moved gracefully through the parted sea of the Seattle elite, leaving the destroyed antagonists behind me on the floor. The public execution was fully complete, the systemic eviction was finalized, and my unyielding legacy was absolutely secure. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs securing Julian's wrists together echoed through the vast stone cathedral, serving as the undeniable final punctuation mark to his fabricated empire. I stood on the elevated marble altar, my custom Dior haute couture gown draping perfectly around my silhouette, and watched the immediate physiological effect that sound had on Savannah. She was still standing near the second row of the wooden pews, her crimson silk dress standing out like a beacon of misplaced ambition. But the moment she comprehended that the man she had conspired with was now a federal prisoner facing decades of incarceration, her entire posture collapsed. The artificial devotion she had projected toward Julian instantly evaporated. Savannah was a creature of pure opportunistic instinct. She looked at Julian with the cold, calculating horror of a parasite realizing its host has just died. She knew that the luxury penthouse they had secured through fraudulent corporate shell companies was already frozen by the federal authorities. She knew the vintage diamond tennis bracelet she wore on her wrist would be seized as physical evidence. She did not offer a single word of comfort to the man who had just destroyed his life to elevate her. Instead, she turned on her stiletto heels and practically sprinted down the side aisle toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. I watched her disappear into the crisp Seattle morning, abandoning Julian without a second thought. They were bound together not by genuine affection, but entirely by toxic greed. The moment the financial incentives were legally vaporized, their alliance dissolved into nothingness. Julian watched her leave his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his absolute isolation. He opened his mouth to call out her name, but the lead federal agent forcefully guided him forward, removing him from the sanctuary and from my life forever. With Julian and his mistress officially excised from the environment, the suffocating silence of the cathedral settled onto the shoulders of Beatrice Prescott. She was kneeling on the cold, polished stone floor, surrounded by the scattered foreclosure documents that detailed her impending eviction. The Seattle elite and venture capitalists who had filled the pews to witness my anticipated humiliation had completely turned their backs on her. They were quietly filtering out of the main doors, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Prescott family collapse. Beatrice slowly raised her head, looking around the empty space of the sanctuary she no longer owned. Her preserved aristocratic features were twisted into a grotesque mask of sheer terror. She looked at me standing above her on the marble altar. For the very first time in our 5-year acquaintance, Beatrice actually saw me. She did not see a struggling freelance accountant. She saw the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling Capital Management. She saw a billionaire who held the legal authority to either save her ancestral legacy or crush it into dust. She had spent years attempting to destroy the only woman possessing the financial magnitude to rescue her family from total destitution. She had traded a limitless fortune for the hollow satisfaction of her own arrogant vanity. Her breathing became ragged and shallow. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive silk skirt tearing against the unforgiving stone flooring. She crawled toward the base of the marble steps, reaching her trembling hands out toward the hem of my Dior gown. "Victoria," she gasped, her voice breaking into a pathetic, fractured sob. "Please, Victoria, you cannot do this to us. You cannot throw me out onto the street like a common vagrant. I have nowhere to go. The estate is my entire life. My family built this legacy. You must understand the pressure we were under. Julian made terrible mistakes, but he was just trying to protect our name. We are family, Victoria. You were about to marry my son. We were supposed to be family. You have more money than you could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. You could stop the sheriffs right now. You could cancel the foreclosure and let me stay. Please, I am begging you, have mercy on your family." I looked down at her hands, frantically grasping at the empty air inches from my pristine white silk. I simply stared at her with an expression of profound clinical detachment. It was genuinely fascinating to witness the extreme elasticity of her morals. When she believed she held the power, I was a classless peasant unfit to step foot inside her home. The moment the power dynamic reversed, I was suddenly a cherished family member, obligated to provide her with unlimited financial salvation. I tilted my head slightly, observing her desperate weeping without a single trace of empathy. Beatrice, I said, my voice perfectly modulated and carrying the cold, merciless edge of a seasoned corporate predator. You do not possess the capacity to understand the concept of family. Family requires mutual honor, unwavering respect, and a foundation of genuine loyalty. You operated under the assumption that loyalty was a one-way street demanding my complete submission while offering nothing but toxic condescension in return. You and your son mistook my quiet patience for intellectual weakness. You thought my lack of a pretentious pedigree made me an easy target for your systemic exploitation. True power does not rely on ancestral estates or borrowed country club memberships. True power is the ability to construct an empire with your own hands and the absolute willingness to dismantle anyone who attempts to steal it. You chose your path when you decided to treat my existence as a joke. I will not finance your delusions for another second. You are not my family, Beatrice. You are simply a defaulted asset on my corporate ledger. I turned away from her pathetic sobbing. I looked at Marcus Washington, who had stood silently by my side observing the entire execution with deep, respectful approval. He offered me his arm. I placed my hand on his tailored sleeve, and together we walked down the central marble stairs, leaving Beatrice kneeling in the ruins of her own catastrophic hubris. I walked out of the cathedral and stepped into the crisp Seattle air, ready to reclaim my throne. 1 week after federal authorities escorted Julian Prescott out of the historic downtown cathedral, I sat at the head of the boardroom table inside the sterling Capitol Management Tower. Morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I wore a sharply tailored burgundy silk suit that projected an aura of absolute unyielding authority. The rich color was a deliberate choice, serving as a physical manifestation of reclaimed power and a permanent departure from the drab of the rack polyester I wore during my 5-year stress test. I looked over the sprawling Seattle skyline, observing the massive commercial properties my firm controlled. The city hummed with continuous financial activity. The chaotic noise of the Prescott family had been permanently silenced, replaced by the quiet, efficient hum of my elite corporate machinery. My lead litigator, Rachel Morrison, and my senior forensic accountant, Dana, sat to my left arranging thick legal binders. They spent 7 days working in tandem with federal prosecutors to systematically dismantle every remaining fragment of Julian's fabricated venture capital firm. Rachel slid the master liquidation agreement across the walnut table. I picked up my solid gold Cartier fountain pen, feeling the reassuring weight of the bespoke instrument. Julian was currently in a federal holding facility, awaiting arraignment on wire fraud and embezzlement charges. Because he signed that predatory prenuptial agreement and personally assumed all fraudulent corporate debt, the federal government had swiftly frozen and seized all his external assets to satisfy the massive financial restitution he owed. My firm bankruptcy courts granted me the absolute right to absorb his remaining legitimate operational infrastructure. I signed the transfer authorizations with a steady, deliberate hand. I was officially acquiring the physical servers, the office leases, and the scattered remnants of his technology portfolio for pennies on the dollar. More importantly, the blockchain watermark I had embedded into my proprietary trading algorithm had perfectly shielded my intellectual property from the federal asset seizure. The predictive model was now legally and entirely registered under my primary holding company. Julian's entire professional existence had been completely absorbed into my corporate empire. I capped my Cartier pen and shifted my attention to the right side. Marcus Washington sat in a high-backed leather executive chair, projecting the quiet, intense brilliance that had allowed him to build his own formidable real estate empire. He wore a flawless navy blue suit, his posture radiating a deep fundamental integrity that Julian had never possessed. I reached into a secure leather portfolio, resting beside my tablet, and withdrew a thick stack of certified legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. "Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level and carrying a tone of absolute professional respect. When Julian forged your executive signature to secure those massive mezzanine loans, he placed your entire commercial real estate portfolio in immediate jeopardy. He leveraged the ancestral wealth you built for your own children to fund his pathetic mistress's luxury penthouse and his own delusions of grandeur. He assumed that the complex financial web he wove would be impossible to untangle before the commercial lenders initiated foreclosure proceedings against your properties. But Julian severely underestimated the sheer liquid capital and the aggressive legal maneuverability of Sterling Capital Management. One continued watching Marcus look down at the paperwork. Over the past 48 hours, my private equity division completely bought out the compromised mezzanine loans from the primary commercial lenders. We paid the fraudulently incurred debts in full, clearing the toxic financial encumbrances Julian illegally attached to your portfolio. The documents sitting in front of you are the unencumbered, quitclaim deeds and the fully restored titles to every single one of your commercial properties. I am officially transferring the complete legal ownership back to your holding company, free and clear of any institutional liens. I am restoring your stolen equity and permanently securing your hard-earned legacy. Marcus stared at the restored property deeds for a long, silent moment. The immense weight of the potential financial ruin Julian had thrust upon him had been entirely lifted. He looked up from the documents and met my gaze. His eyes conveyed a profound depth of gratitude and a silent acknowledgement of the unbreakable alliance we had forged in the fires of his brother-in-law's systemic betrayal. "You did not have to deploy your own capital to save my properties, Victoria," he said, his deep voice resonating with genuine emotion. "You could have easily allowed the banks to foreclose and then purchased the distressed assets for your own portfolio at a massive discount. That is what a ruthless venture capitalist would have done." I offered him a very slight, genuine smile. "A ruthless venture capitalist operates solely on greed and opportunism," I replied smoothly. "A true legacy builder operates on a foundation of mutual honor and unwavering loyalty. You were the only member of the Prescott extended family who treated me with respect when you believed I was nothing but a struggling freelance accountant. You warned me about Julian's cruel intentions at the rehearsal dinner, risking your own standing to protect my dignity. You demonstrated actual character, Marcus. And because of that character, I am proud to cement our lifelong business partnership today. I announce formalizing the transition of power. As we discussed, you are officially stepping in as the new lead executive of the Restructured Technology Division under my direct oversight. We will dominate this sector together, utilizing my own intellectual property and your unparalleled operational brilliance. We will build an empire that the Prescotts could never even begin to comprehend." Marcus reached across the table, extending his hand. I met his firm handshake, sealing a corporate alliance built on absolute trust and verified integrity. The toxic liability of Julian and Beatrice had been excised from my life like a malignant tumor. I sat at the head of my boardroom surrounded by true loyalty and secure wealth. The transition was flawless. I successfully navigated the betrayal, protected my legacy, and reclaimed my absolute throne. 8 months after the spectacular collapse of his fabricated empire, I walked into the sterile environment of the United States District Court in Washington. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, shutting out the Seattle streets. I wore a tailored charcoal Dior suit and my grandmother's emerald tennis bracelet. I took my seat in the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table. I did not sit there out of a desire for vengeance. I sat there as the primary injured party, representing the absolute authority of Sterling Capital Management. The courtroom lacked the opulent chandeliers and white orchids that decorated the cathedral on our wedding day. It was a space designed strictly for the clinical application of consequence. The side doors open and a federal marshal escorted Julian Prescott into the room. The physical transformation was striking. The bespoke tuxedos and arrogant swagger that defined his persona were completely stripped away. He wore a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. His face carried the hollow gray pallor of a man who spent the last 8 months locked in a federal detention center. Realizing his inherited privilege held absolutely no currency inside the American justice system. Julian took his seat at the defense table. He was not flanked by high-priced corporate fixers, because the prenuptial agreement he forced me to sign bound his fraudulent debts to his personal social security number. His assets were immediately frozen and liquidated to satisfy his massive financial obligations. To my holding company, he was entirely destitute. He was represented by an overworked public defender who spent the last several months searching for a single procedural loophole in the mountain of evidence my team provided. There were no loopholes. My forensic accountant, Dana, and my senior litigator, Rachel Morrison, delivered an airtight digital dossier to the Department of Justice. The chain of custody for the banking records proving his embezzlement was flawless. The blockchain watermark embedded in his stolen trading algorithm unequivocally proved his intent to commit grand intellectual theft. The federal prosecutors did not have to build a case. I handed them a fully assembled structural masterpiece of criminal indictment. Julian attempted to negotiate a plea deal offering non-existent equity and meaningless apologies. The federal prosecutors declined every offer. They recognized the magnitude of his fraud required a definitive public reckoning. The presiding judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dismantling white-collar criminals, took her seat at the elevated mahogany bench. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. She did not offer Julian any patronizing lectures about wasted potential or fallen high society families. She simply opened the thick sentencing report and began to read the cold, hard facts of his systemic betrayal. Julian Prescott. She stated, her voice echoing with absolute legal finality. You have been convicted by a jury of your peers on 12 counts of federal wire fraud, 3 counts of corporate embezzlement, and 1 count of aggravated intellectual property theft. You utilized domestic banking channels to systematically drain venture capital funds, attempting to launder stolen money through blind corporate shells to finance a lifestyle you did not earn. You forged executive signatures to illegally leverage commercial real estate, threatening the financial stability of your own family members. You operated with a profound level of arrogance and a complete disregard for the legal and ethical boundaries of the corporate sector. The judge looked down at Julian over her reading glasses. The American justice system relies on the absolute integrity of our financial institutions. When individuals like you attempt to poison that well for personal vanity, the response must be unequivocal. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a term of 180 months, 15 years, without the possibility of early parole. Julian physically flinched, his shoulders collapsing inward as the sheer weight of the sentence struck him. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, you are hereby ordered to pay the full financial restitution to Sterling Capital Management and the associated injured parties in the amount of $12,400,000. Your personal assets have already been seized and liquidated, but you will carry the remaining balance of this judgment for the rest of your natural life. Your wages will be garnished, your credit will be permanently destroyed, and you will never hold an executive position or a fiduciary responsibility in the United States again. The financial ruin of the entitled betrayer was now an absolute legally binding reality. Julian turned his head slowly, looking back over his shoulder toward the gallery. His hollow eyes locked onto mine. He was searching for something in my expression. Perhaps he was looking for a flicker of pity, a sign of lingering affection, or even the hot satisfaction of vindictive rage. I gave him absolutely nothing. I looked back at him with the precise clinical detachment of a researcher observing the final predictable result of a long and tedious experiment. He had tried to treat me like a disposable charity case to elevate his own pathetic ego. He had attempted to steal my life work to secure a billionaire legacy. He was entirely incapable of building himself. He had engineered his own, the total destruction with every arrogant choice he made. I did not smile. I did not gloat. The profound silence of my gaze communicated the ultimate truth, that he was entirely irrelevant to my existence. The federal marshal placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. He turned back around, his spirit completely broken, and allowed himself to be led out of the courtroom through the heavy side doors. I remained in my seat for a moment longer, absorbing the absolute finality of the moment. The systemic threat to my empire had been permanently neutralized by the unforgiving machinery of the federal courts. I stood up, smoothing the crisp fabric of my Dior jacket, and walked out of the courtroom. The golden hour descended upon the Seattle skyline, casting long dramatic shadows across the glass and steel towers of the financial district. I stood on the expansive terrace of my primary penthouse suite, located on the top floor of the Sterling Capital Management Building. The cool evening breeze carried the distinct crisp scent of the Puget Sound, mixing with the faint hum of the city far below my balcony. I held a crystal goblet filled with a deeply saturated vintage Bordeaux, swirling the dark ruby liquid with a slow, deliberate motion. The heavy platinum and emerald tennis bracelet rested securely against my wrist, a constant physical reminder of the unbroken lineage of strong, capable women who preceded me. I took a slow, measured sip of the exquisite wine, allowing the complex notes of dark fruit and aged oak to ground me in the present moment. The chaotic noise of the past 8 months had completely dissipated, leaving behind a profound, absolute serenity. My personal sanctuary was entirely insulated from the frantic, desperate energy of the parasites who had attempted to infiltrate my life. I looked out over the deep blue waters of the Sound, watching the ferries glide silently toward the islands, and reflected on the absolute finality of the execution I had orchestrated. 5 years ago, I made the strategic decision to adopt the persona of a struggling freelance accountant, specifically to filter out the opportunistic predators that naturally gravitate toward massive institutional wealth. I wanted to find a partner who possessed genuine ambition and unwavering character. Julian Prescott walked into that carefully constructed stress test and failed it with spectacular, catastrophic precision. He mistook my quiet, supportive demeanor for intellectual weakness. He firmly believed his Ivy League pedigree and his aggressive corporate posturing made him inherently superior to a woman he perceived as financially destitute. He was so consumed by his own monumental arrogance that he could not recognize the silent architect standing right next to him. Julian and his mother Beatrice operated under the delusion that power is something you perform for an audience, something you project through stolen diamonds and forged commercial property deeds. They did not understand that true unyielding power is built quietly in boardrooms and secured through ironclad, irrevocable trusts. They demanded my total submission, and in return, I handed them their own complete financial and social annihilation. The current reality of the Prescott family serves as a flawless case study in the devastating consequences of unchecked entitlement. Julian is currently sitting in a sterile federal detention center, wearing a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit stripped of the bespoke Italian suits he purchased with my embezzled venture capital. He will spend the next 15 years of his natural life locked inside the unforgiving machinery of the American justice system, contemplating the precise moment he decided to pierce his own corporate veil. He has absolutely no legal recourse, no financial safety net, and zero remaining social capital. Beatrice is navigating an equally brutal new existence. The historic Mercer Island estate she used to lord over her country club friends is now a highly profitable luxury rental property managed by my real estate division. She was forcefully evicted from her ancestral throne by the county sheriffs and currently resides in a small subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city, completely abandoned by the high society elite who once attended her lavish galas. The financial ruin of the entitled betrayer is absolute and irreversible. They attempted to steal my legacy to fund their pathetic delusions, and they were entirely consumed by the resulting inferno. In stark contrast to their total destruction, the empire I built has only expanded its formidable footprint across the Pacific Northwest. The technological division we restructured from the ashes of Julian's fraudulent firm is thriving beyond our most aggressive quarterly projections. Marcus Washington has proven to be an exceptional lead executive operating with the deep fundamental integrity and strategic brilliance that Julian severely lacked. We have merged our respective holding companies to create an unprecedented alliance dominating both the commercial real estate and the venture capital sectors. Marcus secured his generational wealth and protected his commercial properties from the toxic encumbrances Julian tried to attach to them. Our partnership is a testament to the fact that genuine loyalty is forged through mutual honor and verified professional respect. We do not need to rely on predatory prenuptial agreements or blind corporate shells to protect our assets because our business is entirely legitimate. I surrounded myself with individuals who understand the profound value of authentic collaboration, and I ruthlessly excised those who viewed my existence merely as an opportunity for parasitic extraction. My wealth is protected, my intellectual property is legally secured, and my ancestral legacy remains completely untouched. I raised my crystal goblet to the setting sun, watching the fiery orange light reflect off the surface of the vintage Bordeaux. I felt the steady rhythmic ticking of my solid gold Cartier watch against my pulse, perfectly synchronized with my own internal calm. Many women in my position might have chosen to scream at the rehearsal dinner or weep at the wedding altar. They might have engaged in a messy, emotional public confrontation, begging for basic respect from people entirely incapable of providing it. But the weak seek revenge through shouting and chaotic theatrical displays. The strong seek justice through calculated strategy and the flawless execution of corporate law. I did not ever need to raise my voice to destroy Julian Prescott because the undeniable facts of his federal wire fraud spoke volumes on my behalf. I simply provided the necessary rope and watched with deep clinical detachment as he enthusiastically tied his own noose. I turned away from the glass balcony edge, slowly walking back into the quiet, luxurious expanse of my penthouse. I am Victoria Sterling, the sole architect of my life, and I am exactly where I belong. Living well and reclaiming the throne is always the absolute best revenge possible.